London, 1928. The fog clung low to the pavement outside the Clement and Sons banking house in Bloomsbury. It was the kind of Tuesday morning where time seemed to slow under the damp weight of early spring drizzle. Few would remember that morning for the weather, however. They would remember it for the man in the gray Homburg hat who walked into the bank precisely at 9:16 a.m. He held the door for a secretary. He nodded graciously at the constable's station just beyond the iron railings. His suit was pressed, his shoes shined. He could have been anyone, he could have been no one. But what unfolded over the next 43 minutes would stun London's banking elite and leave Scotland Yard puzzled for decades. The bank itself. Clement and Sons wasn't particularly large, nor was it among the most important financial houses in the city, but it catered to old families, old titles, and older money. The Clement family prided itself on discretion and restraint, the kind of place where cash was counted by hand, ledgers filled out in fountain ink, and the word robbery had not passed the lips of any employee since the bank's founding in 1863. Security was minimal but not absent. One constable made rounds every 20 minutes. A lockbox behind the manager's desk stored high-value items until vault transfer. The vault itself, reinforced, yes, but only locked at the end of each business day. On the morning of March 13, the vault was open. Receipts from the weekend were being reconciled, coin counted, notes arranged. The entrance. According to 6 separate witness accounts, the man in the gray Homburg walked in alone. No one noticed a weapon. He waited patiently in line behind an elderly woman cashing a pension check. When he reached the counter, he handed over a sealed envelope. The teller, Frederick Barnes, age 27, remembered the man smiling as he placed the envelope down. "I believe this is addressed to your manager," the man said. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note on fine cream stationery. "Good morning. This is a robbery. Please remain calm. I am unarmed but highly persuasive. Kindly allow my associates to proceed. No one will be harmed. We will be gone in 14 minutes. I suggest you allow us that courtesy." Just as Barnes read the last line, the side door near the records office clicked open. 2 more men entered, both gloved, suited, and silent. They carried 2 empty valises. A robbery without shouting. This wasn't a smash and grab. There were no raised voices. No guns were ever seen. In fact, no one, not even the bank manager, Mr. Ellis Harrow, could definitively say they were being threatened at all. One of the men simply placed a small stopwatch on the marble counter. He pressed it. It began to tick. Barnes was asked politely to open the rear door to the vault. The assistant manager, a Mr. Harold Twill, was asked just as politely to sit and not use the telephone. No rope, no gags, just suggestion and civility. Inside the vault, the 2 men worked efficiently. One took notes, the other handled the cash and coin. They ignored bearer bonds, safe deposit boxes, and anything that might cause delay. Exactly 13 minutes later, they emerged. The man in the Homburg tipped his hat to the room. "Thank you all. Your cooperation has been exemplary." And they walked out, through the same front door, past the same constable who later testified that he thought they looked like accountants. The immediate aftermath. Harrow waited until the second hand of the wall clock reached the 15-minute mark. Then he called the police. Within 30 minutes, Inspector Lionel Griggs of Scotland Yard was on the scene. Within 2 hours, the bank was sealed, statements taken, and a quiet panic had begun to ripple through London's financial quarter. £2,231 in notes, £508 in coin. That was the official amount stolen, nearly £170,000 in today's money. Not a staggering sum, but the method of its taking. That was the true shock. The headlines the next day were not lurid. They were, if anything, fascinated. Robbers display manners. Bank left embarrassed but intact. The Daily Chronicle, March 14, 1928. Tea time theft. No force, no guns, just theft. The Illustrated London News. The men behind the hats. Forensic investigation was still in its infancy. Fingerprinting existed but relied heavily on known criminal registries. The robbers had worn gloves. There were no prints, no signs of forced entry, no vehicles witnessed, no accents distinct enough to trace. No one ever pulled a weapon. One potential clue, the note's paper, watermarked and traced to a small shop in Knightsbridge, but the proprietor had no memory of who had purchased it. The penmanship, neat, possibly educated, but beyond that, nothing. Police posters showed a sketch of the man in the gray Homburg. It appeared in shop windows, in local post offices, and in the tarooms of Bloomsbury. There were tips, dozens. A man matching the description seen boarding a train to Oxford. Another reported in Liverpool withdrawing money with a false name. But none ever materialized into anything more than smoke. Why so polite? That question haunted investigators more than the missing cash. Why the performance? Why the civility? Some speculated that the lead man had a military background, trained in calm under pressure. Others wondered if it was all part of a deliberate psychological strategy. Keep the victims calm, avoid resistance, remove panic from the equation. Whatever the reason, it worked. No one had resisted, no one had been hurt, and no one had a clue who these people were. The curious letter. 2 weeks after the robbery, Clement and Sons received a letter, postmarked from Bath. It read, "You were most obliging. Your staff is a credit to your establishment. Should our paths cross again, I hope it is under more legal terms. Until then, I remain, respectfully, a gentleman in gray." The letter bore no fingerprints. Its post office, busy and anonymous. It was signed quite literally with a flourish and no name. Scotland Yard took it as a taunt. Harrow kept it in a locked drawer until his death. A case that baffled everyone. There were no arrests, no firm leads, no underworld whispers. It was as if the robbers had been plucked from fog and returned to it. Even now, nearly a century later, it remains one of the strangest unsolved robberies in British history. But perhaps the greatest mystery isn't who they were, but why they behaved the way they did. Could civility have been a disguise more effective than any mask? Or was this simply a case of clever men proving a point? The newspapers eventually moved on. Other crimes, bloodier, louder, captured the public's attention. But within Scotland Yard's Serious Crimes Division, Inspector Lionel Griggs remained fixated. He wasn't a man known for obsession. He had handled murders in Mayfair, jewel thefts in Piccadilly, and a brief infiltration of the Soho gaming dens. But there was something about this case, the quiet of it, that unnerved him. No violence, no boasting, no trace. And above all, no motive that made sense. Unusual patterns and an old lead. 2 months after the robbery, Griggs revisited every statement, every piece of evidence, every dead-end file. That's when something finally tugged at his memory. A case, not identical but eerily similar. Antwerp, 1926. A modest savings bank robbed in broad daylight by 3 suited men. No weapons, no threats. A note, a stopwatch, and precise timing. The amount stolen, approximately 48,000 Belgian francs. That case had also gone cold. The Belgian authorities called the culprits Lesham's phantoms, the ghost men. Griggs sent a wire to Inspector Van de Waal, who had led the Belgian case. Days later, a file arrived hand-delivered by diplomatic courier. Inside were copies of witness statements, sketches, and most notably, a photograph of a handwritten note. The paper was different, but the phrasing was nearly identical. "This is a robbery. Kindly remain seated. No harm is intended, nor will any be delivered. We thank you for your calmness." Griggs, by now, had nearly memorized the London note. Comparing the two side by side, he noticed the same loop in the Y. the same upward flick on the F in forgive. A handwriting expert confirmed it. Same writer. The men in the gray suits hadn't debuted in London. They had practiced, refined, perfected. The Gray Gentleman sightings. Over the following months, similar crimes emerged across Europe. Bordeaux, 1925, a mid-sized shipping bank. No witnesses could recall how the men entered or left. Copenhagen, 1927, an unarmed robbery executed with such politeness that the staff didn't report it until an hour later, convinced it was a misunderstanding. Geneva, 1928, 2 months before London. The vault manager claimed the thieves even apologized for the inconvenience. None of these cases had been linked before. No shared suspects, no criminal underworld chatter. Each time the perpetrators behaved like consummate professionals, suited, mannered, untraceable. Griggs called them the Gray Gentlemen. The press never caught on he never told them. This wasn't a story for headlines. This was something quieter, deeper. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a pattern. Inside the ledger. One clue previously overlooked had to do with timing. The London robbery had been meticulously timed 14 minutes, no more. In Geneva, a teller swore one of the robbers was checking his watch against the vault clock. In Antwerp, Van de Waal noted the use of a wind-up stopwatch. Griggs brought in a horologist and expert in timepieces. He was shown the Geneva report and the London bank stopwatch, left behind after the London job. It was of Swiss make, pre-WWI design, common among engineers and interestingly watchmakers. The expert offered something chillingly poetic. They move like time itself, quiet, precise, and always gone before you notice they were there. A ghost from the Great War. Griggs began digging into post-war military records. He theorized that the ringleader, the man in the gray Homburg, had a background in logistics, possibly a quartermaster or engineer, someone trained in coordination, timing, planning. He looked at former officers dishonorably discharged between 1900 and 1925, men who had disappeared, changed identities, or fled the country. The pool was enormous, but one name jumped out. Captain Alastair Pennington. Born 1886, commissioned in 1914, served in the Royal Engineers, fought at Ypres, decorated for logistics under fire, discharged in 1919 for conduct unbecoming, details sealed. He disappeared in 1920, last known residence, a boarding house in Clerkenwell. Griggs visited it in May 1928. The building still stood, now a lodging house for railway clerks. The landlady was new, the records gone. But a retired porter remembered the name. Quiet chap, always polite, wore a gray hat, I believe, spoke French too, disappeared after some men came to call one night, foreigners, I think. No forwarding address. Just a room left immaculate and locked. The watchmaker's shop. Griggs's next break came from an unlikely place, a second-hand shop near King's Cross. A Swiss watchmaker, M. Joubert, had reported a strange interaction earlier that year. 3 men had come into his shop together. One did all the talking in perfect French. They asked about timing mechanisms, discussed minute hand precision, and inquired about a custom stopwatch, capable of being read from across a room. Joubert said they were respectful, intelligent, and unusually interested in time. He filed a report only because they paid in Belgian francs and refused receipts. Scotland Yard had dismissed it at the time, but now it fit like a puzzle piece. Griggs believed it was them weeks before the robbery, scouting the necessary tools. The third man theory. One element of the crime still troubled Griggs, the second vault man. Witnesses recalled 2 assistants, one doing the counting, the other managing the timing and bagging. But Griggs, based on various statements, believed there was a third man unseen, outside the bank. CCTV didn't exist, but what little timeline was reconstructed suggested that someone had been watching the constable's rounds. The robbers entered exactly 3 minutes after the beat cop passed by the gate. Griggs believed a third man had been stationed nearby, a signal given, possibly a handkerchief raised or a car window cracked. Several shopkeepers were questioned. None remembered anything unusual. Except one, a tobacconist. He vaguely recalled a man in a dark coat who stood across the street that morning, didn't buy anything, didn't move, just watched the bank, then vanished. You know what was strange? The tobacconist added. He checked his watch every 2 minutes. The vault clerk who left town. 3 weeks after the robbery, bank clerk Frederick Barnes, the same man who had first received the note, resigned unexpectedly. Said he wanted a quieter life in the country. Harrow was stunned. Barnes had worked at Clement & Sons since age 19. He just turned 27. Griggs interviewed him in his lodgings in Kent. Barnes was polite, nervous, but calm. He insisted he'd had nothing to do with the robbery, that the event had shaken him, that he no longer trusted his ability to be near large sums of money. Griggs pressed harder. Was he threatened? Was he bribed? Barnes denied everything. But something stuck in Griggs's mind. Barnes' suitcase, seen briefly at the doorway, had a luggage sticker from Geneva. Griggs didn't mention it. He left quietly. But from that moment on, he suspected Barnes knew more than he had ever said. The discreet society. Later that year, in the margins of investigation, a curious theory emerged from an ex-intelligence officer Griggs had once worked with. The robberies, he suggested, were not just for profit. They were demonstrations, controlled exercises, orchestrated to prove precision, teamwork, and order. He believed the men may have been former operatives frustrated by post-war bureaucracy, now working independently or perhaps for a shadowy network of gentlemen criminals. A club, a society, a network. Griggs dismissed the idea at first, but it lingered. Especially after he learned of a private dinner held in Paris in 1929, a gathering of former military strategists, engineers, and financiers, anonymous invitations, no media, no record of speakers. And one of the waiters, when later questioned about attendees, remembered a man with a British accent, a gray Homburg on the coat rack. A case without noise. What made the robbery so strange wasn't just its civility. It was the absence of all the usual markers of criminality. No threats. No aliases later uncovered. No attempts to fence stolen items, because the items stolen were untraceable. No known ties to criminal syndicates. No reemergence years later with flashy lifestyles. They were gone. Like smoke. Like gentlemen who had no desire to be found, only to be remembered. Griggs retired in 1946. He kept the note from the bank in a personal file, alongside the Geneva photograph, the watchmaker's testimony, and a handwritten list of European robberies between 1923 and 1931 that he believed were linked. The final page had only one sentence written at the bottom. They understood time, and time in the end always wins. The last clue. In the late summer of 1930, 2.5 years after the Clement & Sons robbery, an unusual package arrived at Scotland Yard. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, just Serious Crimes Division attention. Former Inspector Lionel Griggs, retired. The parcel was neatly wrapped in brown wax paper tied with string. No return address, postmarked from Brussels. Inside was a single item, a pocket watch. It was old, scratched around the rim, but finely made Swiss, 1912, with an engraving on the interior lid. To time, who takes everything. No fingerprints, no additional notes, just the timepiece. But when the watch was opened and the second hand clicked into motion, The ticking was unmistakably identical to the stopwatch left behind at the London robbery, confirmed by a yard horologist. Griggs, long since retired to Sussex, was summoned for consultation. He examined the watch in silence for nearly an hour. "It's them," he said finally, "but they're not taunting us, they're closing the book." A quiet end to quiet crime. Despite continued efforts, no arrests were ever made in connection with the Clement and Sons robbery or any of its suspected counterparts in Europe. The bank, having recovered through insurance, eventually replaced its internal policies. A new vault system was installed. Armed guards were hired, but the staff, particularly the older tellers, often spoke of the robbery not with fear but with confusion. "They were polite," said Margaret Winsley, a secretary present that day. "You expect evil to come shouting. They didn't shout. They said thank you." The remaining letters, especially the one signed "A Gentleman in Grey," were quietly archived. The Clement family, ever mindful of public image, discouraged further publicity. They believed that drawing attention would only encourage imitators. But none ever came. There were no copycat crimes with the same level of polish, planning, and control. The Grey gentlemen, it seemed, were singular. The watchmaker's suicide. In 1934, Maurice Joubert, the Swiss watchmaker who had once described the robbers as respectful, was found dead in his London flat. Suicide by gas inhalation. In his effects was a journal, written in French. Among mundane entries about business and the failing economy, one page stood out. "They returned just once, paid in silence. One left behind a note, said it was never about the money, said the real theft was time and that we had all wasted hours." Scotland Yard reopened the file for 72 hours. Nothing further was found. The case was closed once again. The fatting of Barnes. Of all the original bank staff, the one whose life changed most drastically was Frederick Barnes, the young teller who'd received the first note. He had vanished from Kent by 1931. A landlady claimed he left in the middle of the night, having paid a year in advance. Years later, a man matching his description was reported working in a library in the Netherlands. Another claimed he was living in Lisbon under the name Frederico B., teaching English. None of these sightings were confirmed. But one curious footnote exists. In 1965, a man using the name Fred B.C. bequeathed a sum of money to the British Red Cross in his, well, exactly £2,231, the precise amount of banknotes stolen in the Clement and Sons job. The solicitor who processed the will noted that it came from a client with no known family, no debts, and an accent that was unmistakably London, though aged by years abroad. Was it Barnes, or a final echo of the crime? The money was accepted, the name quietly buried. What was stolen, really? The crime had all the hallmarks of a robbery. Money was taken, laws were broken. But as decades passed, criminologists, historians, and even retired detectives began to question what actually was stolen. Was it money, or something less tangible? Here, what the Grey gentlemen didn't take. They didn't harm anyone. They didn't breach safes or destroy property. They didn't seek fame, nor spend lavishly afterward. They didn't repeat the act in the same country again. It was almost as if the crime had been a demonstration, a proof of concept, not of criminality, but of control. Control over fear. Control over time. Control over people. Some theorized they were former military men driven by ideology. Others claimed they were anarchists making a statement against capitalist structures. But no manifestos appeared. No underground leaflets. No secret societies revealed. Just silence. Reflections from Scotland Yard. In the 1950s, a younger detective named Harold Ambrose revisited the case for a lecture series on unsolved crimes. He gained access to Griggs's files still marked sensitive. In his notes, Ambrose wrote, "We do not understand the mind that seeks not riches, not violence, not fame, but simply to prove that it could be done. The polite robbers were not thieves in the traditional sense. They were philosophers with briefcases." Ambrose also uncovered something odd. Internal memos from the Belgian police in 1927 suggested a suspect identified only as AP was tracked to a villa in Luxembourg. He disappeared 3 days before the authorities arrived. AP Alastair Pennington. A search of villa records showed no leases under that name, but a neighbor recalled an Englishman with quiet manners and a nice watch. That was all. The final theory: were they ever caught? No known arrests, no trials, no deathbed confessions. But one letter, discovered in a private archive in France in 1972, has continued to spark debate. It was addressed to a solicitor in Marseille and marked to be opened upon my death. The author's name was redacted, but the language was telling. "I regret nothing. We harmed no one. We proved it could be done. London was the last. Time, I fear, is no longer on my side. Tell no stories. Let the silence speak for itself." The letter contained no explicit admission of a crime, but the date June 1931 was 2 years after the Clement and Sons job. The language matched the phrasing used in the original London note. The signature: A.G. A gentleman. Legacy of the polite robbery. The Clement and Sons case was never taught in standard criminal training. It was too strange, too clean. But among veteran detectives, it became legend. A case of what crime could look like in the hands of men who studied, prepared, and respected the process of theft as though it were an art. The phrase polite robbery became shorthand for any crime committed with restraint and minimal force, though few ever lived up to the original. And in 1999, when the bank building was sold and converted into a private office suite, one of the workers doing renovations found something unusual behind a false panel in what used to be the manager's office. A watch, dusty, broken, stopped at 9:59 a.m. The exact time the robbers walked out the door. What remains unanswered? Who were the gray gentlemen really? Were they soldiers turned criminals, or something more unusual, men who viewed theft as a commentary on society's vulnerabilities? Why did they stop? And why was the Clement and Sons robbery chosen as their finale? Was it simply the right opportunity, or a symbolic farewell? These are questions no one has answered, not then and not now, because in the end, the polite robbery wasn't just a theft of money. It was a theft of certainty, of expectations, of noise. A quiet crime, like a whisper in a crowded room, heard only by those who knew where to listen. Edinburgh, 1937. In the shadow of Edinburgh Castle, the old city stirs with early morning sounds: the rattle of milk carts, the murmur of newsboys, the distant clang of trams. Yet on one unremarkable Monday at precisely 8:42 a.m., a clerk named Donald Greer failed to show up to work at Macfarlane and Knox Accountancy, tucked quietly on Rose Street. Donald Greer had never missed a day. Not in 11 years. He was punctual to the minute every day but Sunday, a thin, pale man with wire-rimmed glasses and shoes always slightly too polished. His colleagues called him the metronome, not out of affection but grudging respect. When Greer did not arrive that day, no letter, no call, no footsteps in the hall, the office manager, Mr. Roderick Steele, waited precisely 15 minutes past the hour before summoning police. He later said, "If Greer didn't come in, something was wrong, very wrong." And so began one of the strangest disappearances in Scottish history. A man who lived like clockwork, gone without a trace. A life in ledgers. Donald Greer was 42 years old, unmarried, lived alone in a modest two-room flat on Canongate. Rent was always paid early. Neighbors reported little noise, sometimes a cough, rarely a conversation. He had worked at McFarlane and Knox since 1926, performing back-office tasks no one else wanted, reconciling estate records, chasing minor tax discrepancies, handwriting invoices in perfectly measured script. He did not own a telephone, he did not drink, he did not travel. On Fridays, he took a copy of The Scotsman and a flask of tea to Prince's Street Gardens, always sitting on the same bench, always facing the same statue of Sir James Young Simpson. He was a ghost of routine, which is why his vanishing set off alarm bells that clanged far beyond the halls of his firm. The apartment clue. When police entered his flat later that morning, they found everything in place. His bed was made. A small tin of tea was still warm on the stove. A single egg had been boiled and left, uncracked, in a cup. His boots were missing, but his slippers remained by the bed. There were no signs of struggle, no broken locks, no blood. The only thing even slightly out of place, a narrow ladder propped beneath the rear window leading down into the alley behind the building. It was not Greer's ladder. Neighbors hadn't seen anyone carry it in. No shop nearby reported one missing, and Greer's window, typically shut, had been left unlatched. A job too perfect. Inspector Hugh Calder of the Edinburgh Police was put on the case. A quiet man himself, Calder had a reputation for noticing the things others missed. He reviewed Greer's desk at McFarlane and Knox. There, he found everything in perfect order: inkwell refilled, blotter clean, ledgers closed, and a stamped letter addressed to a Mr. Raymond Lafferty, senior partner at the firm. The letter read, "Dear Sir, please find enclosed the revised reconciliations for the Burnside estate. There was an inconsistency with the executor's personal account that I have corrected. I trust this brings the matter to full resolution. Respectfully, D. Greer." There was no farewell, no hint of distress, just a meticulous sign-off from a man who treated even minor discrepancies as near moral failings. Yet when Calder examined the Burnside estate file, he found something curious. There had been no inconsistency. Greer had inserted a revised ledger page with minor amendments, but the original document, still archived in an earlier folder, had matched perfectly. Why fake a correction? A man without past. Calder expanded his inquiry. He spoke with Greer's surviving family, a distant cousin in Inverness, who claimed not to have seen Donald since 1921. He asked after university records. There were none. Greer had listed Edinburgh University, 1912-1916, on his employment file, but no such student had ever graduated under his name. There were no school photos, no childhood addresses. Even his national identity card, issued in 1919, was a replacement filed under loss due to fire. But no fire had ever been reported at his listed address. What Calder discovered was shocking in its own right. Donald Greer may never have existed before 1921. The envelope at the library. The next break came not from police work, but from a librarian. 3 days after Greer's disappearance, a brown envelope was found tucked inside a volume of Blackstone's commentaries, in the reference section of the Advocate's Library, one of Greer's known haunts. It contained a small key, a folded piece of paper with a set of coordinates, and a note in Greer's handwriting. "If I have not returned by now, I do not expect to." The note was unsigned. The coordinates pointed to a storage unit on the outskirts of Leith, near the docks. Inside the storage unit, Calder with 2 constables visited the unit. The lock opened with the key. Inside, in stark contrast to Greer's Spartan flat, was a collection of strange items. A briefcase containing 1,400 pounds in banknotes, nearly 10 years' salary for a clerk. A stack of passports, British, Dutch, and Swiss, all bearing photographs of Greer, but under different names. A typewritten manuscript titled, "On Patterns of Bureaucratic Subversion in Civil Systems." A collection of copied estate documents, many of which were marked void or altered. And finally, a photograph. It showed Greer smiling, a rare sight, shaking hands with a man identified in a handwritten label as Aubrey L. Jennings, an American diplomat who had disappeared during a diplomatic scandal in Berlin in 1925. What was a minor Scottish accountant doing with an ex-diplomat wanted in 3 countries? The Jennings connection. Jennings was a name not heard in British intelligence circles for over a decade. In 1925, he had vanished while under investigation for leaking economic plans related to post-war German reparations. The U.S. State Department disavowed him. Europe believed he had fled to South America. And yet, here he was grinning in a black and white photo with a man the world knew only as Donald Greer. Investigators began to look at Greer not as a man who vanished, but as a man who had constructed a life for the purpose of vanishing. The latter, the false document, the precise habits. It was all a machine, finely tuned, built to evaporate at a moment's notice. Then came the letter. 2 weeks after the discovery of the storage unit, the Edinburgh police received a letter. Typed, postmarked from Lisbon. It was addressed to Inspector Hugh Calder. "You are to be commended for your thoroughness. I knew I'd leave behind a few threads, but you pulled them well. My name was never Greer. That was simply the latest in a series of masks. I was born in Belfast under a name I discarded before my 20th birthday. For the past 15 years, I've operated within systems that reward invisibility. The man I met in 1925, Jennings, taught me that the real currency is not money but records. Change the paper, you change the person. Erase the paper, you erase the person. I chose to erase myself." The letter was unsigned. Why disappear? Was Greer a forger, a spy, a whistleblower? No charges were ever brought. No money was ever claimed as stolen. The estates he had managed showed no evidence of embezzlement. And yet the documents found in the storage unit painted a damning picture. There were references to altered property titles, forged inheritances, and even tax offset schemes that exploited wartime loopholes. It's possible Greer had built a network of fraudulent paper trails within the Scottish estate system, quietly redirecting funds, adjusting names, even reassigning identities. All without a single complaint, because everything looked normal. Everything was filed, stamped, and balanced. The trail ends in Portugal. A final telegram arrived at Macfarlane and Knox in late 1938, sent from a cafe in Porto. It simply read, "The numbers never lie, but sometimes the man does. I hope your ledgers balance without me, DG." There were no further sightings, no additional letters, nothing from Interpol, nothing from MI5. Inspector Calder retired in 1943, convinced that Greer had fled to South America under one of his alternate identities. He left behind one unresolved line in his case notes. If a man builds a life out of numbers, is his soul measured in columns, or something we've never learned to audit? The mystery of Donald Greer, if that was ever his name, deepened in the months following his disappearance. With each clue, each contradiction, a portrait began to form, not of a missing man, but of a constructed life. Greer hadn't vanished. He had designed his vanishing. And behind that act was a mind obsessed with invisible architecture, a mastery of paperwork, systems, and the quiet spaces between official lines. The manuscript in the storage unit. When Inspector Hugh Calder recovered the briefcase in the Leith storage unit, The most telling object wasn't the cash or the forged passports. It was the 72-page typewritten manuscript on patterns of bureaucratic subversion in civil systems. No author listed, but the pages bore Greer's meticulous corrections in the margins, tight cursive loops, page markers, and alternative phrases written in blue pencil. The manuscript was broken into 3 parts. Part I, on visibility. Part II, the shape of absence. Part III, paper and power. It wasn't written like a criminal confession. It was written like a theory, an academic treatise that read more like a manual for ghosts. One line, circled twice by Calder, stood out. If a man obeys the structure, he is seen. If he learns to bend it, he is powerful. But if he learns to mimic the structure while remaining outside of it, he becomes untouchable. Was this how Greer had operated? Was this the guiding principle that allowed him to slip through one of the most well-documented societies in Europe without ever truly existing? Reconstructing the scheme. By mid-1938, Calder and a small team of investigators from Edinburgh and London pieced together what they believed to be Greer's entire operation. It began in 1921, 2 years after the end of the Great War. Records showed the sudden employment of a Donald Greer at a small accounting firm in Aberdeen. Before that, nothing. No school records, no war service, no known family connections. From Aberdeen, he moved to Dundee, then Glasgow, and finally Edinburgh, each time taking progressively more responsible roles in estate accounting, always dealing in paperwork rather than cash. He never married, never drank, never joined clubs. He lived in rented flats under the same name, but always paid in cash, always gave references from previous firms where no formal contracts had ever been signed. His professional conduct was unimpeachable. His personal life was invisible. Calder's theory. Greer had created a paper identity, built layer by layer until it seemed too consistent to question. And while he worked quietly inside legitimate firms, he also maintained a second set of books, an invisible structure that allowed him to shift inheritance values, redirect minor funds, and even create entirely fictional beneficiaries for small estate claims. The changes were subtle, never more than a few pounds here, a title deed reworded there. But over time, the money and the records added up. The Lafferty connection. One of the more curious elements of the Greer file was his regular correspondence with Raymond Lafferty, the senior partner at Macfarlane and Knox. Lafferty was old school. He disliked modern systems and trusted in handwritten ledgers. He also had secrets. In 1933, a minor audit of the firm had flagged a discrepancy in the Dunmore estate, where the executor had received a payout despite never submitting the required Form C-17 for proof of residence. The signature. Witnessed and verified by Donald Greer. No criminal charges were filed, just a quiet correction. But it established a pattern. Greer was the gatekeeper of paperwork, and Lafferty seemed to know that. A letter found in Lafferty's private file, dated January 1937, 2 months before Greer's disappearance, read, "D. Whatever you're planning, do not involve the Deansfield file. That one is too exposed. Stick with Dunmore and Rothby. Quiet hands. R." The implication was chilling. Greer wasn't just forging or manipulating estates. He may have been working in cooperation with his employer. Or worse, controlling him. The philosopher forger. One of the strangest discoveries came in the form of 3 letters tucked into the back of Greer's manuscript. They were unsent drafts, addressed to various institutions. The Inland Revenue, the University of Edinburgh, and the British Library. In each, Greer proposed lectures or essays on structural trust, archival fragility, and the illusion of identity in civil systems. He offered to speak under a pseudonym, Care. He never mailed them. But what they suggested was unnerving. Greer wasn't just committing fraud. He believed himself to be studying it, mapping it, perhaps even improving it. He saw the machinery of bureaucracy not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. A kind of art, a new science of disappearing through documentation. The strange estate of Mrs. Lang. In the summer of 1936, Greer had handled the estate of Mrs. Agnes Lang, a wealthy widow from Leith who passed with no known heirs. According to probate records, Greer filed all the necessary paperwork, sold the property, and transferred the remaining funds to the Crown Standard Protocol for unclaimed estates. But when Calder examined the land registry transfer, he noticed something odd. The property had been sold to a Mrs. M. Penrose, a name that did not appear in the will, and who paid in cash. Further digging showed that Mrs. Penrose had never lived there. The house sat empty for a year, then was sold again, quietly at a loss to an overseas investor. One of the passports in the Leith storage unit bore the name Margaret Penrose, with Greer's face in disguise. It appeared that Greer had sold the estate to himself, using a false identity, and laundered the funds through legitimate means. The method was legal on paper. Only the intent was criminal. And it had worked. An old man in Buenos Aires. In 1948, long after the war, a British merchant marine officer claimed to have met a man in Buenos Aires at a dinner for expatriates. The man was thin, older, quiet, but precise in speech. He spoke about Scotland, paperwork, and the things no one checks. He introduced himself only as Mr. Care. When the officer mentioned Edinburgh, the man reportedly smiled and said, "Ah, that old fog, I lived there once. Best place to disappear in plain sight." The merchant didn't think much of it at the time, but years later, while reading an article about unsolved British financial crimes, the name Donald Greer jumped out. He submitted a statement. Nothing came of it. But Calder, still alive and living in retirement in the Highlands, believed him. "It fits," he told a journalist in 1952. "It was never about escape. It was about control. Greer didn't run. He released himself like slipping a knot you've tied for years." The final ledger. Greer's final act, his ledger of erasure. As Calder called it, was not a grand embezzlement or a violent departure. It was the gradual rewriting of his own history. Every estate managed had errors corrected too perfectly. Every beneficiary appeared to exist until you pulled at the thread. Every document was pristine, but the originals had vanished. His own birth, education, and military records had quietly dissolved under a tide of forged replacements. And by the time authorities realized the extent of the forgery, there was no one to charge. Even his name was a lie. The trail led to smoke. The records led to mirrors. A thought to haunt the archives. To this day, no institution has definitively calculated how much money Greer may have manipulated. Some estimate 40,000 pound 50,000. Others believe it was closer to 100,000 pounds, a small fortune in interwar Britain. But the greater theft, Calder believed, was not of wealth but of certainty. Greer's legacy was simple. He exposed how faith in paper could be exploited, how order itself could be used as camouflage, and how a man with no violence, no accomplices, and no greed could disappear by becoming exactly what everyone expected him to be. But what drove him? Was it ideology, loneliness, boredom, or the thrill of dismantling systems from within? And if he was capable of such precision, what else might he have done slipped behind the fabric of institutions the way he vanished from the page? By the close of 1938, the disappearance of Donald Greer had become less of a police matter and more of an intellectual curiosity, a puzzle that appealed to legal scholars, archivists, and eventually, cryptographers. Though Scotland Yard quietly closed its case, others picked it up, not to arrest him but to understand him. Because the further they investigated, the more it seemed that Greer had done something extraordinary, not merely vanish, but redefine what it meant to exist in a bureaucratic society. He had built a life in paper, manipulated systems without hacking them, and then, when it suited him, vanished through the very records he'd once authored. The Greer case's surface. In 1939, an anonymous tip led Edinburgh police to a solicitor's office in Dunfermline. There, a junior clerk, while clearing a cabinet, discovered 5 estate case files that appeared to bear Greer's handwriting on key forms, despite the firm having no official record of him ever working there. Each case involved the transfer of property or assets from elderly or deceased clients to previously unrecorded beneficiaries, some with names later discovered to be dead ends, others linked to bank accounts that had since been closed. It was a strange echo of the patterns Calder had seen at Macfarlane and Knox, but occurring years earlier, and under a different alias, Douglas Care. The implication was clear. Greer's Edinburgh life was not his first experiment. It was simply the most refined. The paper people theory. The files gave rise to what's now known among criminologists and legal historians as the paper people theory. The idea that Greer had, over time, not only erased his own identity, but had created others entirely from forged documents. These were not just fake aliases. They were fully constructed individuals, supported by invented birth certificates, forged witness testimonies, falsified employment histories, and even medical records registered under alternate names. In one case, a man named Franklin Muir was listed as the sole heir to an estate in Perthshire. The man's entire backstory was confirmed by paper trail from a boarding school in Glasgow to service in a logistics battalion during the Great War. But no such person had ever physically existed. And yet the estate was legally transferred. How? Because Greer understood the system. He understood that bureaucracy trusted its own machinery more than it trusted memory. If the files agreed, the story must be true. The Lisbon Letter, Second Correspondence. In 1940, during wartime intelligence collection in Lisbon, MI6 intercepted a letter that bore several markings connected to known aliases of espionage activity. Though encrypted, once deciphered, the letter was addressed to my former self. Investigators now believe it was a note written by Greer possibly to his own future reader, or to authorities he assumed might someday catch up with him. It read in part, "I was never interested in wealth. I took only what I needed to remain untethered. What fascinated me was the blind trust in form." A signature here, a seal there. How quickly men believe. I learned that the more official you appear, the less you are questioned. The uniform of ink is stronger than any soldier's coat. The final line was chilling. "I do not fear being found. I have already replaced myself with someone better." Calder's private notes, the ghost of a clerk. Inspector Hugh Calder, long retired, passed away in 1955. Among his personal effects was a sealed folder labeled GRER Final. It contained his personal reflections, photographs, clippings, and handwritten notes never submitted to official files. Here's an excerpt. Greer did not hate the system. He revered it, but he saw its weakness as deeply as its strength. He didn't need to create chaos. He only needed to understand the order better than anyone else. He was not a thief, not in the traditional sense. He didn't steal for greed. He rewrote the structure that held power and then walked away. I believe he is still out there, or was, not living richly but perhaps freely, watching the rest of us cling to the illusion that our names and our paperwork are who we are. Calder included in the file a hand-drawn diagram, what he called the Greer model, At the center was a name. Around it, in radiating rings, were points labeled: accountancy, estate law, local registries, clerical trust. Time. Greer's system, Calder wrote, was not built on evasion. It was built on insertion. He placed himself where no one ever looks closely between the lines of paper, inside the ordinary. The Final Whisper, Argentina, 1963. In 1963, a British journalist named Thomas Redding was investigating ex-Nazi escape routes in South America when he visited a quiet town outside Rosario, Argentina. There, he met an elderly Englishman known locally as Mr. Graham. He taught bookkeeping to shopkeepers, helped locals translate estate documents, and was respected for his punctuality and quiet demeanor. Redding, intrigued, asked him where he was from. The man answered with a faint smile. "I used to live beneath a castle, fog every morning, ledgers every night." When Redding asked what brought him to Argentina, the man replied, "I needed to forget a few things, and I needed to be forgotten." He died 6 months later of natural causes. His body was cremated. His passport Swiss listed his name as Daniel Kerr. Legacy of a ghost. To this day, the true number of identities Greer constructed remains unknown. Legal historians believe he may have managed or influenced the movement of hundreds of thousands of pounds through falsified, but technically legal estate transfers. Yet no living relatives ever filed complaints. No victims ever stepped forward. No violent act was ever attributed to him. The damage, if it was damage, was philosophical more than financial. Greer proved something many bureaucrats, police, and civil servants had long suspected, but never fully acknowledged: that the systems we build to define truth files, ledgers, notarized signatures can themselves be manipulated into lies that look official. Was he a criminal or a genius? That question remains unanswered. Some have called Greer a criminal mastermind. Others see him as a kind of protester, a man who revealed the brittleness of bureaucratic systems by infiltrating them. Still others consider him a philosopher in disguise, a clerk who looked at society's endless filing cabinets and asked, "What happens if we fake everything?" Greer's quiet revolution. What set Donald Greer apart was not violence, greed, or spectacle. It was patience. He studied forms. He obeyed systems. He gained trust. And then he used that trust to quietly rewrite reality, until the man himself disappeared in the very ink he once used to construct others. He became, in every sense, a fiction made real, a ghost in the machine, a lesson in how even the dullest-looking man might, if sufficiently skilled and sufficiently invisible, rewrite the rules beneath your nose. Reflection. In a world obsessed with attention, Greer's story is a reminder of the power of silence, of stillness, of precision. He didn't shout. He didn't leave blood. He didn't steal jewels. He simply erased himself with the same careful hand he once used to balance columns. And somewhere, in some dusty file in some forgotten office, his signature may still sit perfectly curved, perfectly placed next to someone else's truth. Somerset, England, February 1952. It was a pale, wet morning in the western fields, one of those damp, fog-drenched landscapes that seemed to breathe mist from the earth itself. The reeds were tall, the marsh water slick and still. Out here, on the fringes of human settlement, the only consistent noise was the distant hoot of a train heading west, or the occasional bark of a shepherd's dog. But on the morning of February 17th, something broke the silence. A farmhand named Walter Briggs, while repairing fencing along the edge of the marsh, spotted what at first appeared to be a discarded sack caught in the brambles. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was not a sack at all. It was a body. Face down, limbs folded unnaturally, one boot missing and a deep gash across the back of the neck. The clothes were torn, but not from a struggle, more like they'd been dragged. And in the coat pocket, a strange item, a half-torn railway timetable from Bristol to Paddington, marked with an X on the 6:05 a.m. departure. The body had no identification, no wallet, no watch, not even a wedding ring. But the man would soon be identified, and his story would lead investigators into one of the most unsettling rural murder mysteries the West Country had ever seen. The name Reginald Sharp. By February 19th, after circulating sketches through the local press and railway offices, the police confirmed the body as Reginald Sharp, 47, a junior solicitor from Bath who had reportedly left his home 5 days earlier on February 12th. His wife, Margaret Sharp, had not reported him missing until the 15th. She claimed it was not unusual for her husband to disappear for a few days on business, especially if it involved delicate legal matters for wealthy clients. Still, her hesitation to report raised early suspicions. The couple had no children, lived modestly in a stone house on Larkhall Rise. Neighbors described Sharp as a quiet man, deeply private, almost uncomfortable in conversation. His law firm, Harrow and Bellamy, confirmed he had not been scheduled for any appointments or travel that week. In fact, Sharp had not appeared at the office since the 11th, one day before his disappearance. Initial autopsy and the odd details. The post-mortem was performed by Dr. Evan Mill, a seasoned coroner in Bristol. The cause of death was exsanguination from a single, deep incision across the back of the neck, executed with alarming precision. The cut severed the carotid artery but missed the spinal cord. The angle of the wound suggested the killer had attacked from behind, possibly from a slightly higher position. Other curious details emerged. No defensive wounds. No water in the lungs, suggesting the body had not drowned, despite being found near the water. A layer of peat moss under the victim's nails, which did not match the soil near the body. And finally, ligature marks on both wrists, subtle, faded, suggesting the victim had been restrained at some earlier point, then released. This combination of evidence told an unsettling story. Reginald Sharp had not been killed at the site. He had been held somewhere, then transported, then left in the marsh, but not buried, not hidden. Placed. The Weston Fields. Weston Fields lie east of the village of East Brent, a low-lying wetland dotted with old farmhouses and long-abandoned peat-cutting sheds. To the police, the setting raised logistical questions. Why transport a body here miles from any main road? Why risk moving a corpse across difficult terrain? And why leave the body face-up in the open brambles? Local superstition also made its way into conversations. Villagers spoke of the Brent Hollow Man, a legend of a ghost said to appear after moonless nights, warning of betrayal and death. The coroner's van, while collecting the body, had been spat at by a farmer's wife. "I told you," she said, "nothing good comes out of the marsh." But police, unmoved by folklore, began to trace Sharp's final days using rail and road records. The ticket that shouldn't exist. The torn timetable in Sharp's pocket bore a faint pencil marking 6:05 a.m. to Paddington. Investigators discovered that a ticket matching that route had been purchased on the morning of February 13th, one day after Sharp was last seen alive. The ticket was purchased with cash at Bristol Temple Meads Station. The name on the stub was R. Shore. Was this a coincidence, a misprint, or a false identity used by someone connected to the murder? The station clerk remembered the transaction only vaguely. A man, mid-40s, wearing a brown wool coat and hat, had bought a single fare to London. No luggage, no briefcase. He looked nervous, the clerk said, like a man trying to appear invisible. Police cross-referenced train arrivals in London that day, but no one named R. Shore, was ever identified, nor did any hotels report a check-in under that name. Who had used the name? And why carry a copy of the schedule to a destination you never reached? Unless the schedule wasn't a travel plan, it was a signal. The suspicious solicitors passed. As investigators dug into Reginald Sharp's professional life, they uncovered a cluster of irregularities in his financial behavior. Multiple small accounts under different names. Regular cash withdrawals totaling over £4,000 between 1949 and 1951. And most curious of all, a pattern of travel to Somerset villages, where Sharp represented unnamed clients in private land purchases. The purchases were odd, worthless stretches of marshland, empty barns, and in one case, a collapsed peat shed in East Brent. No records indicated who the buyers were, but the funds came from a holding account known only as Celandine Holdings, a paper entity set up through a law firm in Jersey. In essence, Sharp had acted as a proxy. He'd moved land, money, and deeds for someone or something without revealing their identity. Was he laundering property? Was he blackmailed? Or had he himself become entangled in something deeper? Margaret Sharp's silence. On February 20th, Detective Edwin Marsh questioned Margaret Sharp for a second time. This time, her demeanor had changed. Gone was the composed solicitor's wife. She appeared tense, agitated. Her hands trembled as she poured tea. "I didn't ask about him those nights," she confessed. "He would disappear for days at a time, always came back." When asked if she suspected he was having an affair, she replied, "No, he wasn't that kind of man. He was hiding something, but it wasn't a woman." When pressed further, Margaret produced a sealed envelope from a drawer in the bureau. It had no address, just her name. "I found this in his coat after he didn't come home," she said. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a line of typed text. "If anything happens to me, it's because of what I found in the Brent shed." The Brent shed. On February 22nd, police located the property legally owned by a shell company tied to Sharp's estate. It was a ruin, 3 walls, half a roof, caved-in floorboards. But beneath the collapsed boards, wrapped in oilskin and twine, officers discovered a small tin box. Inside were several pages of old letters and handwritten notes, a map of the Weston Fields marked with 4 red circles, and a small, torn photograph of a man in a priest's collar, standing beside a military truck. The letters were dated 1919-1923 and written in German. Translated, they revealed correspondence between a former Army chaplain and a British logistics officer regarding the storage of munitions post-armistice. They referenced buried weapons, chemical canisters, and sealed boxes not to be disturbed for 20 years. Could it be? Could Sharp have uncovered evidence of a long-forgotten military cover-up hidden in the fields outside East Brent? And if so, did he try to blackmail someone? Too many questions, too few answers. As the evidence mounted, so did the uncertainty. Sharp had been restrained, possibly interrogated. He had been killed elsewhere and placed in the marsh. He had been involved in secret land deals tied to a shadow company. And he had stumbled upon buried military secrets, potentially dangerous, certainly illegal. But no suspects were ever arrested. No motive ever proven. The priest in the photograph was never identified. The military officer, if he existed, never came forward. And the marked red circles on the map, when excavated, each revealed nothing but disturbed soil. Was it all a red herring, a paranoid man's delusion? Or had someone arrived first, cleaned the scene, erased the trace, silenced the solicitor? The Weston Field murder, as it became known, remains one of England's most unsettling rural crimes. Because unlike urban mysteries with witnesses, cameras, and footprints, This was a crime swallowed by nature. Fog, peat, and silence. A man died, no one saw it. No one claimed him. No one avenged him. Only the marsh remained wet, quiet, waiting. By the end of February 1952, the murder of Reginald Sharp had evolved from a simple case of an unidentified body in a marsh to a deeply entangled mystery, one involving shell companies, decades-old military secrets, and now, a photograph of a man in a priest's collar standing beside a military truck. The photograph, discovered beneath the floorboards of the ruined Brent shed, raised more questions than it answered. Who was the priest? Why was he standing near wartime equipment? And how was this image tied to a rural solicitor's murder 30 years later? The photograph in the truck. The photograph itself was small, no more than 3 inches wide. It was aged, torn at the corner, and had no annotations on the back, but details emerged under closer inspection. The truck was military issue, likely a British Bedford MWD model used in the First World War. The priest's collar was Roman, not Anglican. The background was indistinct, but the tree line and marsh-like vegetation resembled the Somerset levels. A military historian from the War Office dated the image to circa 1919-1921, during the post-war demobilization phase. During this time, many munitions were not returned to bases, but rather buried or destroyed in remote areas. Could the Western Fields have been one such site? The Royal Engineers' shadow. Detective Marsh requested access to Ministry of Defense records from the immediate post-war period. What he received was thin. Most of the Western Field operations had been decommissioned, without detailed inventory. However, one line item stood out in a 1920 report from the Royal Engineers. Non-recoverable stock to be entombed, Brent Marsh Sector Class 3 materials, handle per your restraint order. The term Class 3 referred to toxic or volatile materials, typically gas canisters or unstable munitions. A follow-up revealed that several such orders were signed by Major Rupert Eddington, a logistics officer known for overseeing disposal projects. Major Eddington died in 1948, but a search of his effects revealed a letter never posted addressed to a Reverend Alastair Maddox, Weston-super-Mare. Enter Reverend Maddox. Reverend Alastair Maddox, now in his early 80s, was located at a nursing home in Taunton. He had long since retired from the clergy. When shown the photograph, he blinked, then slowly said, "That was me. That was Rupert's truck." Maddox explained that he had served as an unofficial chaplain for local disposal units after the war. His role had been spiritual, but he had often been asked to bear witness to dangerous operations, especially when records were quietly destroyed or omitted. "There were things buried," he said, "things no one wanted to dig back up. It was considered patriotic back then not to ask questions." "And what of the Brent site?" Maddox nodded gravely. "It was one of the last, February 1921. I remember it because the rain had turned the ground to soup. We sealed it over and put up a warning sign, but that's all. No fence. No records kept, just forgotten." When told about Sharp's murder, Maddox looked disturbed. "I've seen a lot in my years, Inspector, but if someone dug there, they might have found more than they bargained for." Back to the marsh. Armed with this knowledge, Marsh ordered a full excavation of the Brent shed site, not just the marked points on the map, but the entire surrounding area. This time, the results were different. Roughly 50 yards from the original discovery site, beneath 2 feet of compacted peat and clay, they unearthed fragments of rotted wooden crates, rusted metal canisters, some corroded, and several glass vials intact wrapped in oilcloth. The Ministry of Defense intervened within hours. The site was cordoned off, and all recovered materials seized. Officially, the findings were classified as non-explosive historical waste. Unofficially, a MOD liaison quietly told Marsh. Some of those canisters contained chemical agents. If they'd been breached, it could have been catastrophic. The possible motive emerges. It now appeared that Reginald Sharp had discovered the location of a long-forgotten military chemical burial site, collected evidence, the letters and photograph, and may have intended to leverage that knowledge. But for what? Blackmail, a legal claim, public exposure. That question would never be fully answered, but a new detail emerged that added intrigue. A search of Sharp's office revealed a legal draft prepared for filing. Application for injunction to preserve land from development under public safety and environmental protection grounds. The land in question, Brent Marsh sector. Sharp had not filed it. The document was unsigned, but the date on the draft was February 11th, the day before he disappeared. Someone had stopped him. The man with the wool coat, a railway employee from East Brent, came forward in early March. He reported that on February 13th, the morning after Sharp's presumed abduction, he had seen a man mid-40s, wool coat, carrying a briefcase standing near the old Brentfield boundary. The man looked lost, he said, or maybe he was waiting for someone, but what stood out was that he never moved for almost an hour, just stared out at the ground like he was thinking something through. Could this have been the killer? Perhaps a second man involved in covering up the site? Or was it Sharp himself briefly released, only to be taken again? There was no way to be sure. But the timeline lined up. The woman in the widow's house. Then came the final, strangest clue of all. A local woman named Mrs. Elspeth Grange, widowed since the war, lived in a cottage just beyond the edge of Weston Field. On February 14th, at dusk, she swore she saw a man stumble through the back of her garden toward the field. He was bleeding. She described him as tall, gaunt, and wearing a suit. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just moved through the hedgerow and disappeared into the reeds. Too afraid to investigate, she said nothing until weeks later, when the murder was publicized. Shown a photo of Reginald Sharp, she hesitated, then nodded. That was him or his ghost. But why let him go? The wound that killed Sharp was surgically precise. The ligature marks suggested he had been held restrained. But the oddest part of the forensic report remained. There was no blood at the dump site. This strongly implied he was still alive when placed in the brambles. Was he killed later? Or left to die? Some investigators developed a grim theory that Sharp's killers had initially planned only to frighten him or force him to surrender the evidence. But after discovering how much he knew and fearing he might still act, they panicked. And in their panic, they did the one thing Sharp had always avoided. They made themselves visible. No arrest, no justice. Despite mounting evidence of a cover-up, no charges were ever filed. The Brent Field was purchased by the MOD under eminent domain. The site was declared environmentally restricted for agricultural use. And all records related to Celandine Holdings vanished after 1953. Margaret Sharp received a modest insurance payout and moved to Bournemouth, where she died in 1969. The story faded. The marsh reclaimed its silence. A final reflection. Reginald Sharp was not a brave man in the classical sense. He was quiet, cautious, risk-averse. But in the final chapter of his life, he became something few expected. A whistleblower. One who never got the chance to speak. Whatever he found in the Brent shed, whatever he intended to reveal, he took most of it to the grave. But his murder left a mark. A chilling reminder that even the quietest places can hide the darkest truths, and that some secrets are buried not to be forgotten, but to be protected. by any means necessary. As spring crept over the western fields, turning the damp marsh to vibrant green, the investigation into Reginald Sharp's death faded quietly from public conversation. There was no trial, no suspects formally named, no closure for the widow, only an uncomfortable silence from the Ministry of Defense and a land parcel fenced off and labeled restricted environmental risk, no trespassing, under authority of the War Office. A stretch of countryside no one wanted to talk about, where even the birds seemed quieter. The final weeks of Sharp's life. Through careful reconstruction of witness accounts, receipts, and train logs, Detective Edwin Marsh believed he had traced Sharp's last known movements with reasonable accuracy. February 11th, Sharp left his Bath home. He did not report to work. He took a train to Bristol, then another to Highbridge. February 12th, a shopkeeper in East Brent sold a torch and map to a man matching Sharp's description. That night, the weather turned wet. February 13th, a man either Sharp or someone resembling him was seen near the Brent shed, holding what may have been a leather folder. February 14th, Mrs. Elspeth Grange sees a wounded man in her garden, heading toward the marsh. February 17th, Sharp's body is discovered by farmhand Walter Briggs. In that 6-day window, Sharp had vanished from the legal world, wandered into a decaying post-war secret, and died with only fragments of his story preserved. Unsolved threads. 1. The map with the red circles. When the MOD took control of the excavation site, they refused to confirm or deny whether the map found in Sharp's tin box was accurate. But soil tests conducted before their arrival showed anomalies consistent with long-buried metals, some possibly still unrecovered. 2. The canisters. Though officially classified as non-dangerous residue, one internal document leaked decades later referenced traces of chemical agents requiring immediate neutralization. This supported the theory that the burial had included mustard gas or other banned materials. 3. The identity of R. Shore. The train ticket under that name remained unexplained. Had someone impersonated Sharp to throw off investigators? Or was Sharp himself trying to escape, but intercepted before he could reach Paddington? 4. Celandine Holdings. The shell company, through which Sharp had processed multiple property purchases, disappeared entirely. The Jersey law firm that had set it up burned in a suspicious office fire in 1953, destroying years of financial records. 5. The second man. Several accounts referenced a second man seen in a wool coat or driving a lorry near the marsh, but no one could identify him. Not local, not remembered, not seen again. Margaret's interview a decade later. In 1962, a young journalist named Clara Wright, researching government land seizures post-WWAI, tracked down Margaret Sharp, now remarried. To her surprise, Margaret agreed to speak. "I knew Reggie wasn't content," she said, "but I didn't know he was brave. That part I discovered only after he died." She revealed that he'd become increasingly withdrawn in the year before his death, that he kept a folder hidden behind the bookshelf always locked, that he'd stopped drinking tea at home, preferring instead to sit alone at the park for hours, watching birds and taking notes. "He told me once," she recalled, "that paper remembers everything, even when people forget." When asked if she believed he'd been murdered because of what he found, she didn't hesitate. Of course, he found something, and someone powerful made sure he couldn't speak. Wright asked her if she regretted not reporting him missing sooner. Margaret looked away, then said quietly, "I thought if I waited, he might come back changed, but maybe he was already changing into someone I didn't know." MOD interference. Though no official inquiry was launched into government wrongdoing, several investigators on the case privately noted that MOD agents had been present before police had secured the Brent Shed site. Detective Marsh, by then retired, told a BBC interviewer in 1973, "We lost control of that scene almost immediately. We were treated like visitors at our own crime scene. There's no doubt in my mind they knew what was out there long before Sharp did." To the public, the narrative was simple. A man wandered into the marsh. He fell. He died. Tragic but unremarkable. To those who saw the inside of the file, it was anything but. The widow's bequest. In 1980, Margaret Sharp passed away. Her will contained a curious clause. All personal effects related to Reginald, including the contents of the cedar box in my study, are to be donated unopened to the British Library, under embargo until the year 2025. The cedar box, once opened by archivists, contained Sharp's original draft legal injunction, a second copy of the map with red circles, a handwritten journal with entries from February 5/11, and the photograph of Reverend Maddox and the military truck. Archivists noted that Sharp's handwriting grew shakier over those days. One line from the final entry read, "They thought they buried a mistake, but I found it. Now I don't know if I should speak or disappear like the rest of them." Did he try to run? The presence of the train schedule, the partially purchased ticket, the alternate identity are sure. Some theorize Sharp was not murdered outright, but rather forced into a staged disappearance, or perhaps given a choice: vanish or die. If so, did he try to escape and fail? Or was he caught trying to outwit forces far larger than him? It's impossible to know. But the idea that he briefly escaped, was hunted, and returned only to die where it all began in the marsh has haunted those who followed the case. The theory that won't die. Retired investigator Marsh penned a private theory shortly before his death in 1984. In his final notes, he wrote, "Sharp was not the target, the story was. The danger wasn't in the munitions themselves. It was in the idea that the government would leave chemical weapons beneath a farm field and forget. Sharp knew that once exposed, it would unravel not just a crime but a system of silence. And that made him unacceptable. Not because of what he stole, but because of what he saw. A crime with no killer. In the end, the Westonfield mystery left no villain, no trial, no confession, no verdict. Only a body, a map, a photograph, and silence. It was a crime not defined by what was taken, but by what was hidden, and the terrible lengths some might go to keep the past buried beneath reeds, fog, and time." Closing reflection. Sometimes the most unsettling crimes are the quiet ones. Not the ones with screaming headlines or courtroom drama, but the ones that vanish, slowly, into government files, forgotten memories, and soft ground that swallows every clue. Reginald Sharp died alone. But he didn't die in vain. Because his story, piecemeal, fragile, incomplete, remains a reminder that even the most unassuming man can, with enough conviction, come dangerously close to the truth. And for that he was erased. Oxford, England, October 1961. Tucked between a tobacconist and a tailor's shop on Holywell Street sat a narrow, dusty storefront with uneven wooden floors and a faint smell of old paper. The hanging sign above read, "Rowan and Finch Antiquarian Booksellers, Est, 1875. It was the kind of place where time slowed, where the sound of turning pages could be heard beneath the tick of an old brass clock. Students came here for obscure Latin texts, collectors for rare volumes, and the occasional don for something, quietly off the record. It was also the last place anyone expected two people to die within 6 days under circumstances so strange, so inexplicable, that it came to be known locally as the bookshop poisonings. The first death, a scholar collapses. On October 4th, Dr. James Whittle, a 53-year-old professor of historical linguistics at Balliol College, arrived at Rowan and Finch just after noon. According to the shop assistant, Whittle was there to examine a rare first edition of William Camden's Britannia, an annotated Latin copy dated 1607, bound in flaxen calfskin. The professor spent 45 minutes seated at the back table, leafing through the pages, occasionally taking notes. The assistant Gareth Cole, age 19, said Whittle was quiet, focused, and a bit flushed. At 12:58 p.m., Whittle stood up, walked 3 steps toward the front desk, and collapsed. He died on the spot. Face pale, lips slightly blue, hand still holding a pencil. Paramedics arrived swiftly, but it was too late. At the time, the cause of death was believed to be a massive heart attack. The body was removed, and the shop closed early out of respect. No one suspected anything more sinister. Not yet. The second death, the collector's demise. On October 10th, 6 days later, a second man, Mr. Leonard Beale, 62, a reclusive book collector from Abingdon, entered the shop to examine a newly acquired copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, inscribed by Edward Fitzgerald himself. He was well known to the staff, regular, punctual, a man of taste. According to Gareth Cole, Beale was in perfect health that morning. He spent about 30 minutes reading near the same back table, coincidentally, the very spot where Whittle had sat. At 1:32 p.m., Beale complained of dizziness. By 1:34, he was unconscious. He died in the hospital 3 hours later, despite emergency efforts. Cause of death: acute organ failure, fast, catastrophic, unusual. This time, something felt off. 2 men. 1 week. Same shop. Same table. The bookshop and its secrets. Rowan and Finch had been in business for nearly a century, passed through 4 generations of discreet, quietly book-obsessed owners. Its current custodian was Miss Edith Finch, 72, stern but polite, known for her encyclopedic memory and formidable attention to detail. When Detective Miles Harrow of the Oxford CID arrived to investigate the second death, Miss Finch insisted the deaths were unrelated. Coincidence, Inspector? Tragic, yes, but not connected. 2 elderly gentlemen, weak hearts and stronger tea than they could handle. But Harrow was unconvinced. Both men had handled rare books. Both sat in the same chair. Both left no sign of trauma, only rapid, internal collapse. And then came the autopsy reports. Traces of poison. Forensic pathologist Dr. Layla Kendry was called in after the second death. She ordered toxicology tests that revealed a shocking result. Both Whittle and Beale had minute traces of thallium in their bloodstreams, an element once used in rat poison and depilatories, now largely banned. Thallium was odorless, tasteless, and extremely lethal in small doses. Symptoms typically included hair loss, nausea, tremors, and if exposure was high enough, death through multi-organ failure. The poison can be absorbed through ingestion, but also through the skin, especially if mixed with an oily carrier. In both cases, no poisoned food, drink, or pills had been found. Then how had the poison been delivered? Harrow's theory: the books themselves. A dusty delivery method. The idea seemed absurd, poisoned books. But Dr. Kendry confirmed it was entirely possible. If the edges of pages were treated with a thallium-based solution, especially an oil suspension, it could transfer to the skin of a reader. Hands would absorb the toxin. Sweat would quicken the absorption. Turning page after page would dose a person slowly, methodically, invisibly. Within hours, symptoms would begin. Within days, the victim would die seemingly of natural causes. Harrow ordered both books quarantined for testing. Camden's Britannia. The Rubaiyat. Both tested positive for thallium residue, particularly along the lower corners of pages, where readers would typically turn them. The bindings were authentic, the paper untouched. No fingerprints, no signs of tampering. The books had been prepared. The list of those who touched them. Miss Finch was horrified. She insisted that both volumes had come from an estate sale just 2 weeks earlier. A wealthy bachelor named Gerald Penrye, recently deceased, had bequeathed his entire private library to the shop. She gave Harrow the list of newly acquired titles. Among them, the Britannia, the Rubaiyat, a series of Victorian medical texts, several books on cryptography and classical poisons, all stored in the back room, all processed by Gareth Cole, the young assistant. When questioned, Cole admitted he had unpacked the books but never read them. He wore cotton gloves while cataloging, he said, as was standard practice. He hadn't touched either book directly. Lucky. The Penrye connection. Gerald Penrye had been a bibliophile, a bachelor and a chemist by profession. He had worked at a pharmaceutical lab in the 1940s, but retired early following a breakdown. Neighbors described him as eccentric, reclusive, and unpleasantly clever. He had no known family, no visitors, and according to Miss Finch, no interest in selling or donating books until suddenly he did. Harrow ordered a search of Penrye's home in Headington, where they found dozens of rare books, an attic-turned laboratory with chemical glassware, empty containers labeled thallium sulfate, and a notebook handwritten with a chilling phrase on the inside cover. Let the mind rot before the pages do. Premeditated murder, but why? 2 men died. Both handled poisoned books. But what was the motive? Penrye was already dead by the time the poisonings occurred. There could be no personal revenge, no thrill from watching the results. Only premeditated malice. But as investigators probed deeper into the backgrounds of Whittle and Beale, they uncovered something surprising. The 2 men had once worked together decades earlier on a wartime government commission, evaluating chemical agents and their deployment logistics. Specifically, both had been involved in the suppression of domestic research into thallium-based compounds, citing them as unreliable and too dangerous for use. In Penrye, he had been one of the young chemists whose project was canceled. His research deemed too volatile was shelved in 1946. 3 lives intersected by an old decision. One that ruined a career and festered unseen for 15 years. A cold, posthumous vengeance. Detective Harrow developed a working theory. Penrye, isolated and consumed by resentment, had spent his later years reading about the very poison that ended his professional life. He knew it intimately. He knew the men who had blocked his work. And when he learned of their shared love of antiquarian books, he devised a method of retribution. He poisoned the pages, then arranged for the books to fall into the hands of those men not by delivering them directly, but by donating them through an innocent third party, Rowan and Finch. By the time the men found the books, Penrye was already in his grave. He never needed to see the results, only to ensure they occurred. But was there a third target? A third book was discovered in Penrye's donation. Not rare, not valuable, just a small medical text on herbal remedies, tucked among the others. Its pages, too, tested positive for thallium. And according to the shop's logs, that book had recently been sold. To whom? Miss Finch could not remember. No receipt had been kept. Paid in cash. The buyer, a young woman, blonde, nervous hands. She had come in asking for books on plants, said she was writing a novel. That was all. A dead chemist's reach. In the end, The case was closed with the official cause of death for both Whittle and Beale listed as thallium poisoning via contaminated materials. No charges filed. The killer was already dead. And yet the case lingered haunting, precise, and unsatisfying. How many other books had Penry poisoned? Were there more deaths to come? Had a third victim already touched poisoned pages and gone home? Detective Harrow never found out. But he often walked past the narrow shop on Hollywell Street, glancing at the sign above and wondering, how many stories are still hiding between the pages? The books had been quarantined. The shop had been cleaned. The poison identified. The man who likely orchestrated it, Gerald Penry, already dead. And yet the investigation into the bookshop poisonings was far from over. Because one book was missing. And with it, a potential third victim. The medical text and the missing customer. The book in question was a modest volume. The Herbal Remedies of the British Isles, published in 1902. Not particularly rare, but an original edition with hand-colored botanical plates. According to Miss Finch's meticulous records, the book was part of the same lot donated by Penry. And like the others, it tested positive for thallium, its page edges lightly dusted with a chemical residue. But unlike the two poisoned books that had stayed in the shop until handled by Whittle and Beale, this book had been sold. Paid in cash, no name taken. And the only clue: a young woman in a red scarf. Blonde, early to mid-20s, thin frame, hands that trembled slightly as she turned the pages. She asked about medicinal herbs, said she was writing a novel about Victorian poisoners. Miss Finch had found her oddly intense, like someone trying to act relaxed but failing. She had purchased the book and left. That was on October 3rd, one day before Whittle died, and 6 days before Beale. Which meant that, if the poisoning had worked the same way, she could be dead already. Tracing the red scarf, Detective Harrow ordered notices posted in libraries, bookshops, and universities, describing the woman and asking for information. It wasn't long before a librarian at Somerville College came forward. She remembered a young woman matching the description. Wore gloves, red scarf, asked about Victorian criminal trials. Signed the visitor's log under the name L. Ingram. The registrar confirmed, Lillian Ingram, 24, a postgraduate literature student. She lived in a small bedsit off Cowley Road. When police arrived, they found her alive. But barely. The third survivor, Lillian Ingram, was found curled on her bed, feverish and shaking. Several strands of hair littered the pillow. A tray of uneaten soup sat nearby, congealed and cold. She was still conscious just. On the table beside her lay the Herbal Remedies book, half-read. She bookmarked a section on foxglove and noted several lines in pencil. When asked what happened, her response was whispered. "I just felt sick. I thought it was flu." She had no idea the book had been laced with poison. Doctors at Radcliffe Infirmary confirmed early-stage thallium poisoning, but because she hadn't spent long with the book and washed her hands often, the exposure had been limited. She would recover. She was lucky. How did she find that book? When Harrow questioned her again 2 days later, Ingram looked pale but lucid. "I was researching poisoners for my dissertation," she explained. "Women in Victorian literature who used plants. I'd been going to shops asking for anything obscure." Rowan and Finch had been recommended to her by a fellow student. She hadn't known Gerald Penry, nor either of the men who died. "I thought it was a stroke of luck finding that book. I even joked to the shop assistant, 'Hope this one's not cursed.'" She gave a small laugh. It didn't reach her eyes. She'd been unknowingly reading from a weapon. A letter from the dead. Then something unexpected happened. On October 18th, just days after Ingram was discharged from hospital, Miss Finch received a letter, postmarked a week prior. The return address: Gerald Penrye's estate. Inside was a typed letter, unsigned, addressed to whom it may concern at Rowan and Finch. I have sent you these books because you will find them valuable. Some may even be dangerous. You may sell them, or not. It is no concern of mine now. Consider them a test for readers and for those who pretend to be scholars. There are few things more poetic than knowledge killing the unworthy. Most books bore, some reveal, one or two punish. But don't worry, the punishment fits the reader. There was no direct mention of Whittle, Beale, or Ingram. No confession. No apology. Just a posthumous sneer. Victims or targets? Harrow, already skeptical of coincidences, began to revisit the victims not just as random readers, but as selected targets. Was it possible that Penrye chose those books specifically to be handled by those men? James Whittle, the linguistics professor, had once reviewed Penrye's early thesis and rejected it. Leonard Beale, the collector, had acquired several rare chemical texts Penrye once tried to buy at auction, outbidding him, and then publishing critiques of amateur collectors like Penrye in a journal article in 1957. And now Ingram. She appeared innocent, but one curious detail emerged from her university file. Her dissertation advisor, Dr. Meredith Langley, who had been Penrye's supervisor in the 1940s, and had written a scathing recommendation against Penrye's PhD continuation. Had Penrye cast his net wider than first imagined? Were the books his way of striking at a circle of rejection? If so, it meant something chilling. The poison wasn't just a method. It was a message. The test theory. Inspector Harrow developed what became known in police circles as the test theory. That Penrye had intentionally poisoned certain books in such a way that only those who engaged deeply with them, readers, thinkers, researchers, would suffer. And only those worthy or distant enough gloved handlers, brief browsers, would survive. It was literary sadism, a deadly critique of intellectual arrogance. He didn't kill randomly. He killed selectively through the very thing he once loved most, books. The archive revelation. In early November, a retired chemist from the Royal Pharmaceutical Society contacted police after reading about the case. He had worked with Penrye in 1945 and remembered his obsession with slow, moral poisons. One afternoon, Penrye had told him, the perfect compound would punish through knowledge, a poison that only kills those who read too far, a chemical footnote. No one had taken it seriously at the time. Now it seemed like a prophecy. Closing the bookshop. Miss Finch closed Rowan and Finch permanently on November 12, 1961. In her statement, she wrote, "A bookshop is meant to offer knowledge and peace. Mine became the setting for loss and horror. I cannot in good conscience continue. Let the shelves rest." The premises were sold. The shop was turned into a travel agency. The smell of musty vellum replaced by glossy posters of sunlit beaches. But those who remembered the case never quite forgot it. A final reflection. What drives a man to weaponize books? For Gerald Penrye, it was a lifetime of resentment, rejection, and quiet bitterness turned scientific. He didn't need bombs. He didn't use knives. He used dust jackets and parchment. He built traps that looked like literature. And in doing so, he reminded the world that even quiet corners, dusty shelves, academic rooms, antique shops can become the stage for calculated violence. A revenge story written one page at a time. The deaths had stopped. The poison had been identified. And Gerald Penrye, the deceased chemist turned literary executioner, had made his silent, posthumous statement. But even after the last drop of thallium was cleaned, the final autopsy completed, and the last dusty shelf cleared, the story refused to close. Because the true terror of the bookshop poisonings was not just in the deaths themselves. It was in the lingering fear that the danger still lingered. In books, on shelves, unnoticed, the inventory of doom. Following the closure of Rowan and Finch, police oversaw a complete forensic inventory of the shop's contents. Over 2,000 volumes were examined by gloved archivists, chemists, and hazardous materials officers. In total, 6 additional books tested positive for thallium traces. These included a botanical text on poisonous fungi, Italy, 1893. A theological pamphlet critiquing papal infallibility, England, 1860. A pocketbook of early chemical warfare methods, France, 1917. A Latin grammar, London, 1722. A treatise on alchemy and medieval poisons, Germany, 1664. A children's fairy tale collection, anonymous author, 1907. The selection puzzled investigators. Unlike the earlier 3 books, these had no obvious connections to Penrye's enemies. So what were they? Stray experiments? False trails? Or worse, books meant for the wrong hands should they fall to them? Each book was sealed in an airtight archival container, catalogued, and sent to a secure government facility likely never to be touched again. And yet the question remained. How many other books had Penrye tainted before these? And how many had already disappeared? The 5th case that almost happened. In early December 1961, nearly 2 months after the second death, a rare book dealer in Manchester, Fraser Quinton, reported a disturbing incident. A first-time customer, young and disheveled, had asked for something obscure, something dangerous from an estate collection. Quinton, suspicious, pressed him on what he meant by dangerous. The customer replied, "Like the ones that kill slow, like that shop down in Oxford." When Quinton asked for his name, the man left in a rush. A week later, a copy of the same 1902 herbal remedies book appeared for sale in a market stall in Birmingham, with 2 pages partially torn out. The bookseller had no idea where it had come from. The missing pages, the section on thallium-based salves, and oddly, a paragraph on digitalis poisoning. The book was confiscated and tested. No poison this time. But the mimicry was clear. The myth of the bookshop poisonings was spreading, and with it the potential for copycats. Lillian Ingram's legacy. Lillian recovered fully. She later completed her dissertation, titling it Ink and Intent: The Literary Roots of Poison in Victorian Britain. In the introduction, she described her near-death experience. "I nearly died from a book, not metaphorically, not from boredom or heartbreak or awe, literally. A man's bitterness soaked the pages, and I unaware read myself toward an ending I never chose." Ingram never returned to rare bookshops, but she did become a lecturer, later penning a popular history of literary poisoners that became a BBC radio series in the 1980s. She always kept the original herbal remedies book in a lead-sealed case in her study. When asked why, she said, "Because evil doesn't vanish when you close a book. It lingers, it waits to be read again." Detective Harrow's final file. Inspector Miles Harrow, who led the investigation, retired in 1966. Before doing so, he wrote a confidential report on the bookshop poisonings, now part of a restricted police archive. In it, he listed his personal conclusions, which remained outside of the public record. That Penrye had intended at least 5 deaths, possibly more. That he tested various poisoning techniques, perfecting a method undetectable to casual readers. That the books were not just traps, but statements each one curated, targeted, and designed to appeal to a specific kind of reader. He ended with this: "I don't believe the point was the poison. I believe it was the act of reading itself that those who were killed were, in his mind, guilty of misusing knowledge, of gatekeeping thought, or of denying him something he believed was rightfully his." He didn't hate books. He hated people who owned them. The forgotten ones. Though the three main cases, Whittle, Beale, and Ingram, were the only confirmed victims or targets, questions remained. A schoolteacher in Sussex, who died suddenly in 1959 after handling rare texts. An antiquarian dealer in Edinburgh collapsed mid-lecture on poisoners. A postman who briefly worked at Penrise's home and was hospitalized with neurological symptoms. None were officially linked, but each shared a curious thread: books, dust, and unexpected decay. Penrise's last room. When Penrise's estate was liquidated, his attic lab was dismantled and sealed. Inside, police found 5 handwritten notebooks filled with chemical diagrams, quotations from obscure literature, and chilling sketches of hands turning pages, slowly blackening. One diagram bore the heading, "Dose through discovery." Another read, "A page should change you or kill you." He seemed to believe books had power, moral, intellectual, even punitive, and that those who denied him that power had to be punished through it. Reflections in the aftermath. The case faded from the national press by 1962, replaced by more glamorous crimes. But in academic circles, it left a lasting scar. Libraries reviewed preservation protocols. Bookshops quietly added warnings about old medical texts. And a new term entered rare book collecting slang: Penride, describing a book that might look too good to be safe. It became a dark joke among scholars. But not everyone laughed. Closing thought. Books are trusted objects. We open them expecting to learn, to escape, to feel something profound. We do not expect them to kill us. The bookshop poisonings were not crimes of rage or impulse. They were crimes of calculation, patience, and intellect turned rancid. And perhaps that's what makes them linger so deeply. They ask a simple, terrifying question: what if the most dangerous thing in the room is the thing you're reading? Loft House, West Yorkshire, March 1973. Beneath the quiet moorlands of northern England, where coal seams cut deep into the earth like forgotten veins, lay Loft House Colliery, a coal mine with a proud, if weathered, reputation. It had seen strikes and accidents, black lungs and black days. But nothing in its century-long operation matched the event that came to define it: the vanishing of Crew 17. A group of 6 miners disappeared into a sealed service tunnel during a routine maintenance shift and were never seen again. No cave-in, no fire, no flooding, just a locked hatch, a string of inconsistent records, and an official report that left more questions than answers. This was not a tale of natural disaster. It was the story of something much stranger and far more deliberate: the shift that never returned. On the morning of March 21, 1973, the Loft House mine opened as usual at 6:00 a.m. under cold, gray skies. Crew 17, a special maintenance team of 6, were assigned to inspect Old Shaft D, a disused portion of the mine that had been officially closed for over a year following miner subsidence. The team included Alan Dean, 42, foreman, 25 years underground; Billy Carter, 29, known for his quick temper and sharper wit; Derek Lowe, 36, explosives technician; Gareth Price, 33, newly transferred from the nearby Charleston pit; Stanley Broad, 58, the oldest on shift, nicknamed Bookie for his constant bets on everything; Len Matheson, 19, apprentice, just 4 months into the job; They entered the lift at 7:04 a.m., descended 1,200 feet, and proceeded via the main access drift to the sealed area. At 7:40 a.m., they passed through the secondary bulkhead leading to Shaft D. A logbook was stamped. A gate was unlocked. They were expected back by 10:30 a.m. They never returned. The alarm is raised. When Crew 17 failed to report by 11:15 a.m., standard radio hails were attempted unsuccessfully. By noon, a search team was dispatched. They reached the bulkhead gate of Shaft D, and what they found left them stunned. The metal gate had been relocked from the inside. Not simply closed, but latched and chained, with the internal security bar inserted a physical mechanism that could only be engaged from the Shaft D side. There were no signs of collapse. No smoke. No sounds. Only silence. With cutting tools, the team broke the gate open and entered Shaft D. Empty shaft, no crew, no tools. The tunnel stretched for nearly 400 yards before ending in a collapsed section, previously documented and sealed off. Along the way, the search team found 6 helmets neatly stacked near a support beam, a thermos flask still warm to the touch, an open toolkit, a discarded newspaper dated the day before. No signs of struggle, blood, or panic. There was no exit from Shaft D except the way they had entered. And yet all 6 men had vanished. No footprints led away. No equipment was missing. Nothing to suggest an accident, a collapse, or even a single soul leaving in haste. They had simply stopped being there. Official response: the inquest begins. By March 23rd, HM Inspectorate of Mines arrived on site. Initial public statements described it as a temporary confusion, likely caused by miscommunications or faulty shift logging. Privately, investigators admitted they were baffled. The mine manager, Edward Skellern, insisted. No men have left the site. No other exits exist. We are dealing with something else, perhaps a psychological event or sabotage. But even that failed to explain the locked gate, secured from within. By week's end, search parties had combed every inch of Shaft D. No bodies, no air pockets, no side tunnels missed. The official report declared: cause of disappearance unknown, investigation ongoing. Off the record, some whispered what no one wanted to write. The men were never meant to be found. The records that didn't match. 6 days after the incident, a young clerk named Maureen Clegg at the Regional Mining Archive came forward with an anomaly. She had accessed the service tunnel blueprints from 1970 for Shaft D and compared them to the 1973 logbook the crew used. She noticed a section of tunnel roughly 80 yards appeared in 1970 records, but was absent in 1973 maps. The bulkhead gate had been moved 40 yards forward. Several auxiliary alcoves, once used for storage and detonation prep, were now unmarked. Had a portion of Shaft D been deliberately erased from maps? And if so, why? When this information was brought to Inspector Michael Levick, he issued a quiet memo to superiors. There is a discrepancy between mapped infrastructure and what our crews now call sealed terrain. I recommend questioning former engineers who worked pre-closure in Shaft D. He was never given approval. 3 days later, he was transferred off the case. Rumors among the miners. While the press moved on and officials issued guarded statements, those closest to the colliery began to talk. Old-timers shared stories in the pubs of Wakefield. The shaft was never safe, said one. You'd hear tapping when no one was near it. Others claimed Shaft D had been used for storage during the war, munitions, secret documents, or worse. Some even whispered that the crew had stumbled into something they weren't meant to see. One anonymous miner claimed, "There's a room down there, A locked room. It was bricked over in the 50s. Someone opened it again, or tried to. But no records supported this. Or at least none made public. A widow's letter. In June 1973, a letter was received by the family of Alan Dean, the foreman of Crew 17. It was postmarked Yorkshire, with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. He's not dead, not buried. They've put the gate back and the lock changed. Look under the west sill. The mind lies, the mind forgets. Police dismissed it as a hoax. But investigators later confirmed that West Sill was a colloquial name for a defunct ventilation branch exactly 80 yards past where the current Shaft D map ended. The same section removed from records. When asked why that area had not been searched, authorities cited structural risk and lack of probable cause. But inside the file marked Lofthouse Incident, restricted, someone had scribbled. Is the mind the weapon or the crime scene? A slow disappearance from memory. By autumn, the case faded. The men were declared presumed dead. Compensation paid. Families quietly advised to move on. The gate to Shaft D was re-welded. The tunnel sealed. But the questions remained buried with it. Who moved the gate? What was hidden in those unmapped 80 yards? Why did no one ever return? And most chilling of all, did Crew 17 stumble upon something they were never meant to leave with? The official narrative had settled. Crew 17 was lost to the depths of Lofthouse Colliery due to unknown causes. Sealed shaft, mysterious disappearance. Case closed. But in the shadows of dusty archives and behind the locked doors of old mining offices, a quieter, more disturbing investigation was unfolding, one led not by police, but by those who had once worked the shaft and remembered what the public had forgotten. Because in the coal fields of West Yorkshire, truth often settled deeper than coal itself. The cartographer's confession. In November 1973, a retired mine surveyor named Horace Milburn came forward. Quiet, precise, and now in his 70s, he had worked in Lofthouse from the 1940s until 1969. Milburn had overseen the last full survey of Shaft D before its closure, and what he said contradicted official records. There were 3 sealed alcoves beyond the secondary gate, he told local journalist Mary Twigg in an off-record interview. We used to store explosives in one, another had tools, but the third we never entered. According to Milburn, the third alcove, designated Chamber 9, had been bricked up in 1952, following a directive from management. He couldn't recall the reason, only that the engineers were told to. Forget it, mark it as collapsed, do not record details. He had written unstable no access on the 1953 map, per instruction. But he never forgot the men who had done the bricking, or the fear in their faces afterward. Whispers of the war years. Deeper still in the oral histories of Lofthouse were tales of World War II activity. During the war, several collieries in Britain were partially repurposed by the government for emergency storage, secure communications relays, even special storage of sensitive materials. The mines were ideal. Dark, silent, hidden from bombers. A Freedom of Information request later filed in 2002, and heavily redacted, revealed that Shaft D had indeed been classified for temporary wartime utility between 1942 and 1945. What was stored there? The documents did not say, but some now speculated that Chamber 9, the one Milburn described, was more than a storage room. It may have been part of that wartime effort. And it had been bricked up, sealed from both memory and map, for over 20 years, until Crew 17 walked into it. The youngest victim's diary. In early 1974, Len Matheson's mother donated a notebook of her son to the Wakefield Mining Archive. It had been found tucked under his bed half-used, with scribbles, shift schedules, and observations from his brief time as an apprentice. The final entry, dated March 20th, 1973, the day before the disappearance, read, "Foreman says we're checking the old shaft tomorrow, not the usual area, something off-map. Carter joked we're going ghost hunting." Dean seemed tense, kept saying just the gate, then back out. "They all say it's routine. Still, I'm packing my own torch." It was signed with a scrawl, "Better overprepared than overburied." The phrase unsettled the archivists. Had Len sensed something? Or had someone told him something? A secret re-entry attempt. In May 1974, a group of 4 miners, all formerly part of the Lofthouse site team, attempted unauthorized access to the Shaft D bulkhead at night. They were stopped before entering the shaft, but their intent was clear. They carried cutting equipment, respirators, and a set of maps not present in any official record. They told police they were just reminiscing. Unofficially, one of the men told a local priest, "We knew they'd found something. Either someone sealed them in to die, or they went into something that was never meant to be opened." No charges were filed, but the incident prompted the full welding shut of Shaft D, now layered with steel plating, concrete, and sealed under 24-hour surveillance by British coal security. Something had changed. Someone was afraid someone else might get in. The ministry steps in. In late 1974, Ministry of Energy officials conducted a quiet visit to the Lofthouse site. They met privately with Edward Skellern, the mine manager, and collected a series of maps, equipment logs, and staff records from 1972-73. 2 weeks later, the internal report, never released publicly, was added to a classified archive held at the National Archives in Kew, marked with a sealed status for 75 years. Investigators were instructed to cease inquiries. No further search teams were permitted, and the phrase repeated in internal memos. National security concerns. The tunnel that doesn't exist. In the years that followed, the mine closed, as many others in the North did. Lofthouse's entrance was filled and capped. Buildings dismantled. Records archived or destroyed. But in 1981, during an unrelated geological survey, ground-penetrating radar of the area revealed a large rectangular void, 40 feet wide, resting beneath where Shaft D had once been. No mention of it existed in geological or mining maps. It was aligned directly beneath the section removed from records, the same area where the bulkhead was moved forward, and Chamber 9 was once bricked up. The void was empty, according to imaging. No movement, no life. But it was there, and it was connected. A haunting echo. In 1985, a group of urban explorers attempting to breach an adjacent sealed colliery shaft nearby, once linked to Lofthouse, reported hearing something that chilled them. They described a metallic knocking, rhythmic and slow, faint breathing like drafts, and most disturbingly, a voice. One explorer claimed it sounded like a call for help, garbled, distant, but unmistakably human. They were removed by police before further investigation. Their audio tapes were later dismissed as wind distortion. But others who listened noted the voice was repeating a name. Broady, the nickname of Stanley Broad, one of the missing 6. Unanswered questions. As the story of Lofthouse faded from headlines and entered folklore, those who had lost loved ones were left with only speculation. The families asked questions. Why were parts of the tunnel erased from maps? What was in Chamber 9? Why was the gate relocked from inside? Why did records disappear? Why had the ministry stepped in? They received nothing but condolences and sealed reports, and the chilling belief that truth had been buried as deeply as the men themselves. A thought from the dark. Shaft D remains sealed. No memorial marks it. No plaque. Just soil and silence. But for those who still remember, it is more than a tragedy. It is a wound in the earth where men went in, and something was found that refused to let them out. Because not all tunnels are meant to be explored, and not all darknesses are empty. By the time Shaft D was permanently sealed, the story of Crew 17 had become something less like a tragedy, and more like a riddle one buried under decades of silence, secrecy, and bureaucratic ash. But even riddles leave behind echoes. And those echoes can be traced if you listen close enough. This final section brings us to the aftermath, the final investigations, the theories that refuse to die, and the legacy of a crime that may have never left evidence, but still left fear. The Last Witness, a miner's breakdown. In 1991, nearly 20 years after the disappearance, a former Lofthouse employee named Frederick Mallory was admitted to a mental health facility in Leeds. Mallory, 67 at the time, had worked as a security watchman at the site in the weeks after the incident. His job had been simple: monitor the surface entrance while investigators were still coming and going. But during one of his therapy sessions, a social worker noted this. He speaks often of the gate that closed itself. He insists he saw it. That it moved, that it was locked from the wrong side. That he heard breathing human and not. Mallory never provided a coherent timeline, but he scribbled something repeatedly in a notebook. They weren't trapped, they were taken. The notebook is now held in the Wakefield Mining Museum's restricted archives. A coded message found. In 1996, a private researcher working with declassified mining files uncovered a scrap of paper tucked inside a structural report on Shaft D. It was folded tightly and appeared hand-typed. No official markings, it read. Gate engaged, Chamber 9 opened. Ingress confirmed. 6 observers neutralized. Do not breach again. The page bore no signature, no date. Was it a fabrication? A hoax from someone inside? Or a quiet acknowledgement of something never meant to be spoken aloud? The phrase ingress confirmed particularly disturbed analysts, because it suggested that something had come in. Or worse, come out. Academic theories, the displacement hypothesis. In 2003, a paper circulated through fringe archaeological circles. Vertical isolation, events in UK subterranean infrastructure, 1940–1980. It proposed that certain wartime tunnels, especially in coal and chalk-based regions, may have intersected natural cavern systems never documented by geological surveys. The theory that Crew 17 may have entered a naturally sealed void, mistaking it for Chamber 9. Once inside, seismic instability or structural shift could have caused the bulkhead gate to close behind them, isolating them permanently. But this theory fails to explain the deliberate relocking of the gate, the stacked helmets found inside, the lack of collapse indicators, and the complete absence of human remains. The government's final word. In 2009, documents related to the Lofthouse disappearance were reviewed for early declassification. They were denied. A memo issued by the Ministry of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy cited sensitive structural intelligence, potential national infrastructure intersection, and public safety risks. Once again, the event was shielded, now officially inaccessible until 2048. By then, every witness would likely be gone. Every family faded. And the mine long forgotten. The colliery's shadow. Today, the land above Lofthouse is green again, overgrown, quiet. Birdsong has returned. Children play where coal trains once rattled by. But locals still avoid one patch of earth. A low rise surrounded by rusted fencing, often damp even in summer. Nothing grows well there. And if you stand still long enough, some say you can feel the air shift, as though a door is opening where none can be seen. Final thoughts: crime without a criminal. If the disappearance of Crew 17 was a crime, it may be the only one in history without a body, a motive, a suspect, or even a known method. The crime scene was a tunnel. The murder weapon may have been a door. And the silence that followed was not neglect, it was policy. So we are left only with this. 6 men went into a tunnel with one known exit. That exit was found locked from the inside. No other route existed. No bodies were ever recovered. And no one ever returned. That isn't an accident. That isn't bad luck. That is a message. And perhaps the real question is not what happened to them, but what were they stopped from bringing back? Leeds, England, 1987. It started, as so many curious things do, with a number that didn't quite add up. In April 1987, the Bradley and Wren financial services firm, a modest but reputable accounting company in Leeds, was undergoing a routine internal audit. These were the types of slow, quiet affairs that rarely drew attention. The kind of process that, ironically, only finds problems when something is going very, very wrong. The firm's audit partner, Angela Pell, was checking over year-end tax reconciliations when she noticed something odd. A secondary approval on multiple high-value transactions was attributed to a man named Douglas Ainsley. He had countersigned forms, logged hours, and left detailed margin notes in accounts payable records. The problem: no one at the firm had ever heard of Douglas Ainsley. He wasn't listed on payroll. He wasn't in HR records. His name appeared on no staff lists, no insurance policies, no building access logs. And yet, over the course of 4 years, Ainsley had allegedly reviewed, signed, or annotated over £2.4 million in client activity. It was as if a ghost accountant had quietly inserted himself into the books, and no one had noticed. Unpacking the ledger, Angela Pell's discovery triggered a quiet but immediate internal investigation. She compiled 71 documents bearing the name Douglas Ainsley. Some bore a full signature, others only DA. Several showed annotations written in an old-fashioned style, with distinctive phrases like "remit as per Wadsworth" and "balance postchit." None of the language was standard for the firm. Some of it, in fact, hadn't been in common use since the 1960s. More troubling, none of the client files Ainsley signed off on were visibly flawed. In fact, they were immaculately balanced. The financial records themselves were clean, no missing funds, no detectable fraud. So then what was Ainsley doing? And why hadn't anyone questioned his role? The photo that wasn't. In an attempt to verify whether Douglas Ainsley was perhaps a temporary contractor or agency staff member from earlier years, Pell requested archived office ID badge photos from 1980 to 1986. She reviewed dozens, and in one of them, an old group shot, taken in front of the company's former Woodhouse Lane office, was a man no one could identify. Fifth from the left. Beige coat, dark tie, standing stiff, unsmiling. His appearance matched the physical description later pieced together from second-hand accounts and scrawled building sign-in sheets. Approximately 511. Balding, pale, early 50s. Carried a brown attaché case and an ivory-handled pen. This man had appeared in 2 different company group photos, always in the back row. But no one remembered him being hired. And even stranger, In 1985, Bradley and Wren had just 18 employees. There were 19 people in the picture. Angela's unofficial digging. Driven by a mix of curiosity and growing unease, Angela went beyond protocol. She reached out to former employees. No one recalled interviewing or working alongside Ainsley. Building security. Logs showed a D. Ainsley signing in sporadically between 1983 and 1986, but all entries were handwritten, no corresponding badge swipes or CCTV. The tax office. No national insurance number was ever filed under that name. Professional registers. No listing with the Institute of Chartered Accountants under Ainsley's name or any variation of it. So Angela made one final call to a contact at HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Within a week, she received a visit. Not a letter, not a return call. A personal, unscheduled visit. The man from the ministry. He arrived unannounced on a Wednesday morning in May 1987. Tall, gray suit, quiet voice, identified only as Mr. Bell. He asked to speak with Angela in private. According to her later testimony, the conversation was brief and unsettling. "Miss Pell," he said, "the name you've inquired about, Douglas Ainsley, is not to be pursued further. If this matter appears in your audit documentation, mark it as a clerical insertion error and move on." Angela pushed back. "Who is he?" Mr. Bell smiled politely. "Not your concern. But I can assure you, he does not work for your firm. He works for no one. And you didn't find him." And with that, he left. The files that were removed. Later that week, Angela returned to the archive to continue her investigation. Every document previously marked with Ainsley's signature had been removed. Folders remained, but the contents were replaced with redacted photocopies. Angela confronted the office manager, who claimed no knowledge of the removal. No one else had accessed the archive that week. She then discovered that her audit login credentials had been revoked. By the end of the month, Angela was placed on indefinite leave, pending an internal review of her conduct. Her mistake: not embezzlement, not negligence, just asking too many questions about a man who left no trace. A history of appearances. After her dismissal, Angela began researching further. What she uncovered was disturbing. Using archived business directories, she located 4 other firms in Birmingham, Manchester, and York that had previously listed Douglas Ainsley as a temporary auditor or associate. Each had similar patterns. No employment record. No tax filing. Annotations on paper records. Disappeared after 2-3 years. One firm owner, now retired, recalled him vividly. Quiet fellow, efficient, polite, bit odd, didn't talk much. Always had the right figures, never asked for pay. We assumed he was from head office. Another firm, in Manchester, had even included him in the staff directory for 1984-85. When contacted, they claimed, "That entry must be an error. No such person worked here. The record has since been corrected." Theories and shadows. Was Ainsley part of a covert government operation? A financial surveillance agent? A quiet forensic auditor used to spot laundering or black market flows? Possibly. But none of the affected firms were tied to criminal investigations, national security concerns, or large-scale fraud. And none of them could recall hearing, speaking to, or paying this man who appeared, contributed, and vanished. Others proposed stranger explanations. A disgraced accountant wiped from public record, living between firms under assumed identities. A master forger embedding himself in companies to reroute funds so subtly no one noticed. An early experiment in human intelligence, laundering someone who infiltrated legitimate companies to monitor cash flows without ever being detected. But these theories required some thread of motive. And Ainsley never appeared to steal, never left damage, never altered figures to cause loss. In fact, he improved the records he touched. So why pretend to be someone he was? And how did he manage it for nearly a decade without being caught? Vanishing point. The last known appearance of Douglas Ainsley occurred in August 1986, 9 months before Angela Pell's discovery. A handwritten signature appeared in the margin of a client audit log at Carby and Snow LLP, a private consultancy in Nottingham. After that, nothing. No sightings. No signatures. No initials. No trace. It was as if Ainsley knew the game was closing and stepped out of it, leaving behind a trail of perfect columns, well-balanced ledgers, and the quiet confusion of those who dared to ask. Who was that man? And why was he here? In the months following her forced departure, Angela Pell refused to let go. She wasn't chasing scandal or whistleblower fame, she was chasing consistency. An accountant's instinct, perhaps. Every number must reconcile. Every entry must tie. But Douglas Ainsley refused to balance. He wasn't an anomaly, he was a calculated insertion. So Angela set out not just to understand who he was, but how he had remained unseen. And what she found was a network of businesses, behaviors, and disappearances that hinted at something much larger than any one company. It was a puzzle built from paper, and every answer she found only raised deeper questions. The Ainsley pattern. Angela created what she called the Ainsley pattern. Target size: 10-25 employee financial firms. Operational period: 2-3 years of presence per location. Documentation trail: always written, never digital. Signature presence: always initials or name in margins of sensitive but non-critical documents. Disappearance: preceded by internal changes, restructures, or quiet buyout. She eventually identified 7 different firms, spread across northern England, where Ainsley's name had briefly flickered into existence. But when she tried to contact these firms directly, she encountered an identical response each time. That staff record was in error. There is no such employee in our archives. We have no comment. One director confided privately. You're not the first to ask, but you should be the last. The protocol. A turning point came when Angela received an unmarked envelope in the post. Inside, a single-page typewritten, no return address, no markings. It was titled, Correction Protocol 12, Finance Sector, Category B, and listed the following instructions. Acknowledge all inquiries as clerical errors. Refer media contacts to the Office of Statistical Integrity. Redact files using non-material loss language. Destroy all physical copies bearing subject signature. If personnel persist, initiate clearance review. At the bottom of the page, in faded red ink. Observer class, AINSLEY 4. Status benign. Do not engage. Angela stared at the words for hours. It wasn't just a man. It was a classification. A program. But what was an observer class? And why benign? What would a non-benign version be? A visit from Bell again. 3 weeks later, Angela received a second visit from the suited man who had first introduced himself as Mr. Bell. No appointment, no warning. She described his demeanor this time as less polite. Miss Pell, I must ask you again to refrain from inquiry into this matter. You've already been warned once. Angela refused. What is Ainsley? Bell paused, then leaned in, as if offering a truth he didn't want to share. He's not a person, he's a tool. He observes, he stabilizes. When the books grow chaotic, he ensures they settle again. Angela asked if Ainsley was real if he was alive. Bell didn't answer. He simply handed her a business card that bore no name, only a phone number and a crest resembling a faded government seal. Then he left. Angela never called. She knew better. The quiet buyout. In 1988, Bradley and Wren, the very firm where the mystery began, was quietly purchased by an unnamed holding company and rebranded. The new management scrubbed historical staff data, destroyed physical archives, and adopted fully digital records. All files between 1980 to 1986 were marked as incomplete migration. Angela later discovered that 2 other firms on her Ainsley list were bought out by the same holding company, under different names. No public explanation. No visible changes, just a new logo, a new server, and a new silence. Who or what was he? Several theories emerged as Angela shared her findings with independent investigators. 1. A government plant. Ainsley may have been a covert economic observer, an embedded agent tasked with identifying illegal finance or at-risk bookkeeping practices. But if so, why the lack of follow-up? Why wasn't anyone prosecuted? 2. A legacy protocol. Some believed Ainsley was part of a Cold War era auditing safeguard, a person trained to stabilize smaller firms at risk of collapse to prevent economic ripple effects. A living firewall. But again, why the secrecy? 3. A constructed identity. The most unsettling theory, that Ainsley never existed in the flesh. That he was a bureaucratic phantom, inserted through forged records, false photos, and manufactured documents. Created not by one person, but by a system, an algorithm of government oversight designed to retroactively balance books by introducing a fictional authority. Someone or something that only existed in paperwork. The pen. Among the few remaining artifacts linked to Ainsley was an ivory-handled fountain pen, recovered in 1987 from the locked drawer of an unused desk in the Bradley and Wren office. It bore no serial number. No markings. Inside it, black ink still fluid. Tucked into the clip, a folded slip of paper. On it, 3 words. You weren't wrong. Angela received the pen anonymously in 1990. It sits unopened in her desk to this day. A new signature appears. In 1994, after 7 years of silence, the name D. Ainsley appeared once more. This time in the audit log of a startup tech consultancy in Edinburgh. Just 2 entries. A handwritten margin note in a quarterly balance sheet, and a redacted copy of a tax form, later replaced. When contacted, the firm denied it had ever existed. But a blurry copy of the balance sheet made it to Angela through a private source. She kept it filed under a heading she never shared with anyone else. One line was circled in red. Reconciled as of instruction, DA. Unresolved questions. Was Douglas Ainsley ever real? If so, was he a man who went too far into secrecy, or a phantom created by that secrecy itself? What was Correction Protocol 12? Who authored it? What happened to the firms after his appearance? Why were some bought, rebranded, or dissolved? Most chilling of all, if someone could be inserted so seamlessly into the official record, without employment, pay, or memory, how many others might there be? And who decides when they are removed? Angela Pell spent the better part of 2 decades chasing shadows. Not scandal, not money. Just one question. How can a person vanish when they were never officially real? The man named Douglas Ainsley had no national ID, no insurance, no bank account, no tax history, no known face beyond a grainy photo where he appeared but didn't belong. And yet, He had touched millions of pounds across half a dozen firms. He had left a trail of order in places where confusion once festered. He had never been caught because no one was looking. And when people did start looking, they were told the same thing. It's nothing, just an error, a clerical ghost. But Angela had a different word for him. A financial apparition. One whose existence was cleaner than any fraudster, but far harder to trace. A digital absence. As the financial sector digitized in the late 1990s, the entire profession changed. Paper was replaced by secure logins, software, time-stamped edits. But something odd happened. Firms that had once hosted Ainsley, those small to mid-sized accounting houses, shut down at a disproportionate rate. Many blamed market consolidation or outdated business models. But Angela saw a pattern. 6 of the original 7 Ainsley firms closed between 1996-2001. All cited internal audit inconsistencies or unresolvable record discrepancies. In at least 3 cases, entire archives were deemed corrupted or non-compliant with digital transition standards. It was as if the transition to digital systems had no place for ghosts. And when the ghosts couldn't follow, they erased the rooms they'd once haunted. The ledger that shouldn't exist. In 2003, Angela was anonymously mailed a package containing a green cloth-bound ledger, postmarked from Manchester. It had no return address. Inside, hand-numbered pages and column after column of transactions, every one tied to a defunct accountancy firm. At the top of each page, Observer Log AINSLEY4. And at the bottom, a small red-inked symbol of a triangle inside a circle. The contents were complex but unmistakable. Entries matching old financial activity, but corrected months in advance. Annotations made in handwriting confirmed, via forensic analysis, to match Ainsley's margin notes. Mentions of Protocol 12, watchline adjustments, and something called reconciliation cascade events. There was also this chilling line, scrawled on page 57. Collapse prevented, no public loss, identity held in storage, awaiting next assignment. Angela didn't understand all of it, but she understood the implications. Ainsley wasn't auditing books. He was auditing reality. Financial redaction as control. A new theory formed, stranger, but disturbingly plausible. What if Ainsley wasn't a man at all, but a construct? A placeholder identity, used by intelligence or economic oversight agencies to quietly correct errors in financial ecosystems, absorb liability without drawing attention, normalize suspicious activity that couldn't be exposed publicly. In essence, a human correction factor injected when systems were about to fail. An algorithm made flesh, or at least made believable. A ghost in the ledger. One that wrote just enough, then vanished. Angela's disappearance. In 2007, Angela Pell was invited to speak at a private academic conference on anomalous trends in post-industrial bookkeeping. She never arrived. Her last confirmed sighting was at a petrol station outside Leeds. She purchased coffee, withdrew £60 from an ATM, and was never seen again. Her car was found 2 weeks later, parked in a long-term storage lot near Manchester Airport. There was no sign of travel, no flight records, no passport activity, no hotel bookings. The pen she had received years earlier, ivory-handled, was found in the glove compartment. The ink had dried. A folder labeled Final Reconciliation sat in the back seat. Inside, a single page. The correction completes when no one remembers the error. DA. Another appearance. In 2016, a junior auditor at a mid-sized Edinburgh consultancy discovered a margin note in a printed invoice reconciliation. The handwriting was old-fashioned. The signature read, D. Ainsley. The page was gone within 48 hours. When the auditor reported it, he was told it had been a test document from a training scenario. He was later laid off without explanation. Before leaving, he snapped a photo of the signature and posted it anonymously to a now-defunct message board for forensic accounting students. It was identified as an exact match for Angela Pell's archived samples. Final thought: ghosts in suits. If Douglas Ainsley existed, he left no fingerprints, no bank trail, no home address. Only signatures. Only corrections. If he didn't exist, if he was a cover identity used by some unknown entity, then someone, or something, had access to dozens of firms, across years, in plain sight. But either way, one fact remains. Every place he appeared became more accurate, more orderly just before it collapsed. He wasn't chaos. He was clarity. The kind that's so sharp it cuts. Maybe he was a function. A safeguard. A construct called in only when a system was close to failure and had to be corrected in ways no public accountant ever could. But then again, if reality can be audited, if a man who doesn't exist can be more effective than one who does, then who else is keeping the books we never see? And who watches the watchers when the watchers are never recorded?